Tonight, we're uncovering the complete story of Alicent Hightower. There are some interesting details to follow, but I'll keep everything gentle enough for sleep. Thank you to those of you who've been joining us consistently. If you're falling asleep with us tonight, let me know in the comments how many nights in a row you've been here. And if this is your first night, just comment night 1. Now back to the video. In the year 88, after Aegon's conquest, Alicent Hightower was born into one of the oldest and most formidable families in Westeros. Her house did not sit upon a dragon's back, nor did it rule from the Iron Throne. Its power rose from Oldtown, from its great white tower overlooking Whispering Sound, from trade, learning, ancient alliances, and a closeness to the faith of the Seven that gave the Hightowers an influence far beyond the reach. Alicent's father was Ser Otto Hightower, a man of careful words, long memory, and unmistakable ambition. Otto served as Hand of the King, standing beside the throne through the last years of King Jaehaerys Targaryen and into the reign of Jaehaerys' grandson, Viserys. To be Otto's daughter was to grow up near the center of power, where a kind expression could conceal a calculation, and where a private conversation might quietly alter the course of a kingdom. At court, Alicent learned the customs of kings and queens while still young. She moved through the Red Keep's candlelit halls, past the high windows, the echoing chambers, and the distant shadow of the Iron Throne itself. In later tellings, she is remembered as graceful, dutiful, and observant. Someone who understood that position was never permanent, and affection at court was rarely uncomplicated. She also came to know Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen, the king's only surviving child by his first queen, Aemma Arryn. Their early closeness would become one of the most quietly painful threads in Alicent's life. Rhaenyra was a dragon rider, a princess, and the declared heir to the realm. Alicent was the daughter of the Hand, close to the royal family but not of it. For a time, the distance between those two positions seemed small enough to cross. Then Queen Aemma died. Her death left King Viserys grieving, and left the realm once more thinking about succession. Viserys had named Rhaenyra his heir, and many lords had sworn to honor that decision. Yet Westeros had seldom been comfortable with a woman set to inherit the Iron Throne. The king needed comfort, companionship, and, in the eyes of many powerful men, more sons. In the year 106 after Aegon's conquest, Viserys chose Alicent Hightower as his second wife. The marriage transformed her life with astonishing speed. Alicent became Queen of the Seven Kingdoms, wearing the crown beside a king far older than herself. She was no longer merely Otto Hightower's daughter or Rhaenyra's companion. She was the queen, and soon she would be the mother of a new royal line. Her first child was a son, Aegon. Then came Helaena, gentle and strange in the way of many Targaryens. Aemond followed, fierce and watchful, born without a dragon, but destined to seek one. Last came Daeron, who spent much of his youth far from King's Landing in Oldtown, among the family roots of his mother's house. Each child made the question surrounding Rhaenyra's inheritance more difficult to ignore. A king's eldest child had been named heir, but a king's eldest son now lived beneath the same roof, carried the blood of the dragon, and had powerful supporters ready to insist that custom favored him. The division did not arrive all at once. It gathered slowly, like clouds over Blackwater Bay. A look in the royal hall, a choice of companion, a rumor carried between servants, a disagreement over marriage or inheritance. In the year 111, Alicent appeared at a tournament in a green gown, while Rhaenyra wore the black and red of House Targaryen. Green became the color of the queen's supporters. Black became the color of the princesses. What began as a fracture within one family would eventually reach every corner of the realm. For Alicent, the struggle was never only about a crown. It was about her father's expectations, her children's safety, her own place in a court shaped by dragons, and the fear that mercy shown to one branch of the royal family might mean ruin for the other. In the quiet spaces of the Red Keep, where silk rustled over stone and ravens came and went from the rookery, the future of Westeros was already beginning to turn. To understand Alicent Hightower, you must first understand the stone and candlelight of Oldtown. The city itself is older than the Iron Throne, older than the Targaryen dynasty, older than the Seven Kingdoms united under a single crown. Its great white tower rises from the shores of Whispering Sound, a beacon that has guided ships for thousands of years. At its base lies the Starry Sept, the holiest place in the faith of the Seven, and the Citadel, where maesters study the mysteries of the world. The high towers do not need dragons to command respect. They have the tallest tower in the known world, the most ancient lineage in the Reach, and a web of influence that stretches from the Citadel's libraries to the Sept's altars. Alicent Hightower was born in the year 88 after Aegon's conquest, into a house that had stood for thousands of years before the Targaryens ever crossed the Narrow Sea. Her family's power rests not on the back of a dragon, but on generations of careful marriages, strategic alliances, and a deep connection to the faith. The Hightowers have always understood that influence is not always worn on the sleeve. It is whispered in the confessionals of the Sept, debated in the halls of the Citadel, and sealed in the ledgers of the trading houses that line the Honeywine. To be born a Hightower is to inherit a legacy of patience and calculation. Her father, Sir Otto Hightower, was a man who understood that the true seat of power was not in Oldtown, but in the Red Keep. He served as Hand of the King under Jaehaerys the Conciliator, and later under Viserys I, and he taught his daughter that proximity to the throne could shape the fate of kingdoms. Otto was not a warrior. He was a courtier, a reader of faces, a weaver of words. He knew that a well-timed silence could be more dangerous than a sword, and that a single letter carried by a raven could undo a decade of peace. Alicent learned from him that the Game of Thrones is played not with steel, but with patience, with memory, with the careful placement of allies. From childhood, Alicent belonged to a world where courtesy, bloodlines, and alliances are forms of power. She learned to curtsy before she learned to read, and to read before she learned to ride. The Sept taught her the prayers of the Seven, the Maesters taught her the histories of the realm, and her father taught her the names of every lord and lady who mattered. She memorized the sigils of the great houses, the marriages that bound them, the feuds that divided them. In the gardens of the Hightower, she practiced the art of conversation, learning to smile at those she distrusted, and to listen more than she spoke. When Otto brought her to King's Landing, she entered a court that was both grand and treacherous. The Red Keep was a maze of marble corridors and hidden passages, where servants whispered and lords plotted. Alicent walked those halls with her eyes open, taking note of who sat close to the king, who was whispered about in the shadows, who had fallen from favor, and who was rising. She saw how quickly a kind word could become a weapon, how a rumor could destroy a reputation, how a marriage could shift the balance of power. She spent hours in the Sept of the Red Keep, kneeling before the altars of the Mother and the Maiden, praying for wisdom and for strength. She read the accounts of queens who had come before her, understanding that their stories were lessons in survival. She learned that a queen's duty was not only to bear children, but to bear the weight of expectation, to smile through grief, to speak softly while thinking sharply. The faith taught her that humility was a virtue, but her father taught her that humility could also be a disguise, and so Alicent Hightower grew, shaped by the ancient stones of Oldtown and the whispering corridors of the Red Keep. The woman she would become was already being forged in the fires of expectation and duty. The realm would soon have need of her, and she would answer in the only language she had ever known, the language of patience, of prayer, of the careful, quiet pursuit of power. When Otto Hightower accepted the position of Hand of the King, he did not simply move his household to the Red Keep. He brought with him a daughter who would one day reshape the realm. Alicent was only a child when she first walked through the gates of King's Landing, but she was old enough to understand that her father's new role meant everything had changed. The High Tower of Oldtown had always been a seat of quiet power, but the Iron Throne was a different kind of game entirely. The Red Keep was a world unto itself, a labyrinth of stone corridors and hidden alcoves where servants moved like shadows and lords whispered in the spaces between formal words. Alicent learned quickly that what was said aloud was rarely what was meant. The courtiers spoke softly, their voices dipped in honey, but their eyes were always watching, always calculating. Favor was a currency that could be earned or lost in a single misstep, and everyone around her was competing for it, whether they admitted it or not. Her father, Otto, was a master of this language. He had served as hand under King Jaehaerys, the Old King, and now he served Viserys I, a king who inherited a peaceful realm but faced the quiet pressures of succession and expectation. Otto understood that power was not worn on the sleeve, but carried in the careful arrangement of alliances, marriages, and rumors. He taught Alicent to listen more than she spoke, to observe the tilt of a head or the pause in a sentence, to know that the court was a stage where every gesture had meaning. Alicent grew up in the shadow of the throne room, where she learned the rituals that governed royal life. Ceremony was the heartbeat of the court, the formal processions, the feasts where seating order mattered as much as the food, the audiences where petitioners knelt and kings dispensed justice or mercy. Prayer was woven into the fabric of each day, the faith of the Seven, a constant presence in the sept that stood within the keep. Alicent spent hours there, not always in devotion, but in the quiet that allowed her to think. Marriage, inheritance, and rumor were the three pillars around which every noble family's fate turned, and she absorbed these lessons as naturally as a child learns a language. The Red Keep became her home, but it was also a cage. She could walk its halls freely, but she could never truly leave. The walls held the weight of centuries of Targaryen rule, and the air was thick with the ghosts of queens and consorts who had come before her. Alicent was not a prisoner in chains, but she was bound by duty, by her father's ambitions, and by the expectations of a court that saw her as a piece in a larger game. She was a Hightower, and the Hightowers had always played the long game. As she grew older, she found herself drawn to the one person in the keep who seemed to move with a freedom that Alicent could only envy. Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen was the king's only living child, a girl with silver hair and a dragon's fire in her eyes. They became companions, reading together in the library, walking the gardens, sharing secrets that only young girls trust. In those early years, there was no rivalry, only the easy bond of two children who understood that their lives were not their own. Alicent saw in Rhaenyra a friend who could laugh without calculation, who could speak without weighing every word. And Rhaenyra saw in Alicent a steady presence, a listener who did not judge. But the court was never far away. Otto Hightower watched his daughter's friendship with the princess with a careful eye. He knew that proximity to the throne was both an opportunity and a risk. The king's council was a place where men jostled for influence, and Otto's position as hand gave him a voice, but it also made him a target. He needed Alicent to be more than a companion to Rhaenyra. She needed to be a symbol of House Hightower's loyalty, a reminder that the Reach was bound to the crown. So Alicent learned to navigate the rituals of royal life, not as a game, but as a survival skill. She attended every ceremony, every prayer service, every formal dinner where the seating chart was a battlefield. She memorized the lineages of the great houses, understood which marriages had strengthened alliances and which had sparked feuds. She listened to the rumors that drifted through the corridors like smoke, knowing that some were planted deliberately and others were seeds of truth. She learned that inheritance was not just about blood, but about perception, about who the lords and small folk believed had the right to rule. The Red Keep shaped her, polished her, hardened her. It gave her a home, but it also gave her a prison. She would never truly escape its walls, not even when she became queen, not even when war tore the realm apart. The court was in her blood now, and the soft-spoken courtiers who smiled while sharpening their knives were her teachers, her rivals, and her mirrors. And as the years passed, the friendship with Rhaenyra deepened, but so did the unspoken tensions. The king's health began to falter, and the question of succession grew louder. Otto Hightower's counsel grew more urgent, more pointed. Alicent found herself caught between her father's ambitions and her own heart, between the loyalty she owed her house and the bond she shared with the princess. The court was a place where every choice had consequences, and she was learning that even the softest words could cut deeper than steel. The hand's place at court was never secure, and neither was his daughter's. But Alicent had learned to stand still while the world shifted around her, to smile while others schemed, to pray while others plotted. She was ready for what came next, even if she did not yet know what that would be. The Red Keep had taught her patience, and patience was the most dangerous weapon of all. The Red Keep was a world of whispers, but for two young women, it was also a world of shared silences. Alicent Hightower had grown up in the shadow of the Iron Throne, learning to read the room before she could properly read a book. But there was one person in the court who did not require such careful study. Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen was the king's only surviving child, a girl of fire and restless energy, and she was exactly Alicent's age. They met in the corridors of Maegor's Holdfast, in the gardens where the red stone caught the afternoon heat, and in the quiet hours when the court slept, and the two of them could simply be themselves. For Alicent, who had spent her childhood watching her father navigate the dangerous currents of court politics, Rhaenyra was a revelation. The princess spoke her mind. She laughed loudly. She did not seem to understand that every word she said might be remembered, repeated, or used against her. And perhaps that was because she was the heir to the Iron Throne. The realm had been told to accept her as the future queen, and so she moved through the world as if it already belonged to her. Alicent, by contrast, was the daughter of the king's most powerful advisor. Otto Hightower had served as Hand of the King under Jaehaerys the Conciliator, and now under Viserys I. He had taught his daughter that power was a thing you held close, not something you flaunted. She learned to listen more than she spoke, to observe more than she acted. But with Rhaenyra, those defenses could lower. The princess did not want a courtier. She wanted a friend. And so the two young women shared the insulated life of the royal court, united by age and expectation. They read together in the library, their voices low as they discussed histories of dragons and the reigns of old kings. They walked along the battlements, looking out over the Blackwater Rush, and Rhaenyra would talk about the day she would ride her dragon, Syrax, across the sea to see the free cities. Alicent would listen, and she would smile, and she would not say that such dreams seemed distant to someone whose family had built its power on the solid, unmoving stone of the Hightower. But the seeds of future tragedy were already being planted, though neither could yet see them. The friendship between a princess and a Hand's daughter was natural, even charming, but the realm was watching. Every moment they spent together was noted by the courtiers who filled the Red Keep. Some saw it as a sign of unity, proof that the king's chosen heir and his most trusted advisor's family were aligned. Others saw it as something else entirely. They whispered that Otto Hightower was using his daughter to get closer to the throne, that the friendship was a strategy, a long game played in silk and smiles. Alicent herself did not think in those terms. She was young, and she was loyal, and she loved Rhaenyra with the uncomplicated affection of someone who had found a kindred spirit in a lonely place. But the court had a way of turning even the purest bonds into currency. And the friendship between these two young women would one day be remembered not as a fond memory, but as the beginning of a rift that would tear the realm apart. For now, though, they were simply girls. Rhaenyra would braid Alicent's hair and tell her stories about the dragon eggs in the royal nursery. Alicent would help the princess with her embroidery, though her stitches were always neater, and Rhaenyra would laugh and say that she would leave the needlework to her friend while she took to the sky. They were inseparable, and in the quiet of the castle, they believed that nothing could change that. But the world outside their friendship was already shifting. King Viserys had lost his wife, Queen Aemma, in a childbirth that had also taken his son. The succession was settled, but the grief in the Red Keep was a living thing, and in that grief there was opportunity. Otto Hightower saw it. The lords of the realm saw it. And soon, the king himself would see it too. The bond between Alicent and Rhaenyra was real, but it existed in a court where every relationship was a political asset. The princess was the future, the Hand's daughter was the present, and the present, as Alicent would learn, always had a way of demanding more than the future was willing to give. The bond between Alicent Hightower and Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen was, in those early years, a genuine and unguarded thing. They were close in age, both young women navigating the strange pressures of court life, and they found in each other a rare kind of understanding. But the world they lived in was not kind to friendship, and it was even less kind to queens. In the year 105 after Aegon's conquest, that world shifted violently. Queen Aemma Arryn, King Viserys I's wife and Rhaenyra's mother, was pregnant again. The king needed a son. He had been on the Iron Throne for nearly a decade, and the succession was a matter of growing concern. His only living child was a daughter, and while the realm had never known a ruling queen in her own right, the precedent was unclear. Viserys wanted a male heir, and he wanted one badly. The pregnancy was difficult from the start. Queen Aemma was in her late 20s, which was considered old for childbirth in Westeros, and she had already endured several miscarriages. The maesters watched her closely, but there was little they could do when the labor began. The birth was prolonged and agonizing. The child was breech, and the maesters knew that if they did not act, both mother and child would be lost. What happened next is one of the most painful moments in the history of the Targaryen dynasty. King Viserys, desperate for a son, made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He allowed the maesters to perform a brutal procedure to save the child, cutting into Queen Aemma's womb to extract the baby. There was no anesthetic, no mercy. She died on the birthing bed, her body torn open, her blood soaking the sheets. The child, a boy, was delivered alive. He was named Baelon, after the king's own father, the beloved prince who had died young, but the infant was weak, and he lived only a single day. Queen Arryn died in 105 AC, and her newborn son, Baelon, died soon afterward, leaving Viserys grief-stricken and childless in the male line. The loss was devastating on every level. Viserys had loved Aemma. She was his cousin, a woman of the Vale, and she had been his partner for over a decade. Her death was not just a political catastrophe, it was a personal wound that never fully healed. The king withdrew into himself, and the court felt the absence of his warmth. But grief could not stop the machinery of state. The question of succession, once a distant concern, was now an urgent political crisis. The realm needed an heir, and Viserys had none. In the months that followed, the king's council debated the matter endlessly. Some lords argued that the throne should pass to Viserys' younger brother, Prince Daemon, a seasoned warrior and dragon rider. But Daemon was unpredictable, ambitious, and deeply unpopular with many of the great houses. Others whispered that the king should remarry immediately to produce a son from a new queen. But Viserys was not ready for that. He was still mourning, and he could not bear to think of another woman in Aemma's place. Instead, he turned to his daughter. Rhaenyra Targaryen was only 8 years old when her mother died, but she was the king's blood, and she had already claimed a dragon of her own, the Golden Syrax. In 105 AC, Viserys made a decision that would shape the future of the realm. He named Rhaenyra his heir, the Princess of Dragonstone, and he called upon the lords of Westeros to swear fealty to her. Many of them did, kneeling before the young girl and pledging their swords to her cause. It was a bold move, and it was meant to secure the succession, but it also planted the seeds of a conflict that would not bloom for another 20 years. Alicent Hightower was there, in the Red Keep, watching all of this unfold. She was 17 years old, a young woman of the court, and she had lost someone too. Queen Aemma had been a friend, a mentor, a figure of grace in a world of ambition. Alicent mourned her, but she also understood that the Queen's death had opened a door. The king was alone, vulnerable, and in need of comfort. And Alicent's father, Otto Hightower, the Hand of the King, was a man who saw opportunity in every shadow. The transition from grief to politics was seamless, almost invisible. Viserys began to spend more time in the company of the Hand's daughter. She read to him, sat with him in the quiet hours, and offered the kind of gentle attention that a grieving man craves. It was not love, at least not at first. It was something more complicated, a mixture of duty, loneliness, and the slow erosion of boundaries. By the end of the year, the king had made up his mind. He would marry again, and he would marry Alicent Hightower. The wedding took place in 106 AC, just over a year after Queen Aemma's death. It was a small ceremony by royal standards, but its implications were enormous. Alicent, the daughter of the Hand, became Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. She was young, barely 18, and she was stepping into a role that had been defined by tragedy. The court watched her closely, and the whispers began almost immediately. Some said she had seduced the king. Others said her father had orchestrated the entire affair. But the truth was simpler and sadder. Alicent was a dutiful daughter, and she did what was asked of her. Rhaenyra, now the heir to the throne, watched her friend marry her father. The friendship between the two young women did not end overnight, but it was never the same. The seeds of rivalry had been planted, watered by grief, ambition, and the cruel logic of dynastic politics. The king had his new queen, and the realm had its heir, but the peace was fragile, and the storm was still gathering on the horizon. The death of Queen Aemma and the infant Prince Balon did not simply leave a vacancy in the royal nursery. It hollowed out the king himself. Viserys I had always been a man who governed through consensus, who preferred the comfort of familiar faces and the steady rhythm of court life. But in the months following the double funeral, that man withdrew. He stopped attending small council meetings with any regularity. He stopped holding court in the Great Hall. The Red Keep, which had always hummed with the quiet machinery of governance, grew still. The king remained in his chambers, and the door, for all practical purposes, was closed. This retreat into grief was not just a personal tragedy. In a monarchy, the king's mood is a matter of state. When the sovereign vanishes into his own sorrow, the vacuum is immediate. Lords and ladies who had relied on the king's ear found themselves speaking to empty air. Petitions went unanswered. The rhythms of appointment and favour, the subtle dance of influence that kept the court alive, began to stutter. And in that silence, the court began to calculate. They watched the closed door. They watched the guards who stood outside it. And they asked themselves the question that always arises when power goes quiet. Who will fill the space? No one watched more carefully than Otto Hightower. As Hand of the King, he was the natural steward of this paralysed realm. But Otto understood that stewardship was not the same as power. He needed access. He needed a presence in the king's private hours, a voice that could speak when the council chamber was empty. And he had, in his own household, the perfect instrument for that task. Alicent Hightower was by now a young woman of 17, raised in the faith of the Seven and the manners of Oldtown. She had grown up in the shadow of the throne, learning the language of courtly deference. As naturally as she learned her letters, she knew how to enter a room without disturbing its mood. She knew how to listen, and she knew, because her father had told her, that the king was suffering. Otto did not frame it as an order. He framed it as a duty. The king needed comfort. The king needed company. And who better to offer that than the daughter of his most loyal servant? So Alicent began to visit the royal apartments. At first, it was a simple errand of courtesy. She brought books from the library, texts on the history of the Reach and the songs of the faith. She sat with the king in the quiet of his solar, reading aloud in a voice that was soft and unhurried. Viserys, who had spent months staring at the same walls, began to listen. He began to respond. He spoke of Aemma, of the son he had lost, of the weight of a crown that demanded heirs he could no longer provide, and Alicent listened. She did not offer solutions. She did not press him toward decisions. She simply remained present, a gentle presence in a room that had been filled only with ghosts. This was not romance, not at first. It was companionship, born of grief and convenience. But in the intimate spaces of the Red Keep, convenience has a way of becoming habit. The king began to look forward to her visits. He began to notice the way she held herself, the careful modesty of her dress, the earnest attention she gave to his every word. For a man who had been surrounded by courtiers all his life, this quiet attention was intoxicating. It was not the flattery of lords seeking favour. It was something rarer, genuine presence. The court, of course, noticed. Whispers began to circulate through the corridors. The Hand's daughter was spending time with the king. The Hand's daughter was reading to him in the evenings. The Hand's daughter was the language of courtly observation, becoming indispensable. And in a court where the king had no wife and no male heir, such whispers carried weight. They carried the weight of succession itself. What began as companionship, as a daughter's dutiful visit to a grieving king, was slowly becoming something else. It was becoming a decision that would not be made in the council chamber, but in the quiet of the royal solar, over pages of old books and the soft sound of a young woman's voice. And that decision, when it came, would divide the realm. By the time the court of King Viserys I had settled into the rhythm of grief, the king's loneliness had become a political fact as solid as the Iron Throne itself. The death of Queen Aemma and the infant Balon had left a silence in the royal apartments that no amount of council business could fill. And into that silence stepped the Hand's daughter, Alicent Hightower. It is difficult to say with certainty how much of what followed was planned by Otto Hightower and how much was simply the natural consequence of proximity. What we do know is that in the months after the Queen's funeral, Alicent became a regular visitor to the king's chambers. She brought him books, read to him from the histories of old Valyria, and sat with him during his long, brooding evenings. The court watched, the whispers began, and by the time the year 106 AC arrived, the rumours had hardened into something close to certainty. The announcement came at a small council meeting, though it was hardly a surprise to those who had been paying attention. King Viserys declared his intention to marry again. He would take Alicent Hightower as his queen. The decision was presented as a matter of comfort and stability, but the political implications were impossible to ignore. The king had chosen the daughter of his hand over the daughter of the sea snake. He had chosen Oldtown over Driftmark. He had chosen a bride whose family was already entrenched in the capital over one who would have brought the wealth and naval power of the Velaryons into the royal household. For Alicent, the announcement meant everything and nothing at the same time. She was no longer simply the Hand's daughter, a well-bred young woman of the court who knew how to curtsy and keep her opinions to herself. She was now the future queen consort of the Seven Kingdoms. The marriage elevated her in a single stroke from a figure of courtly background to one of dynastic consequence. She would wear the crown, sit at the king's side, and bear children who would be princes and princesses of the blood. It was the kind of rise that the histories would record as a triumph of ambition. But for a girl of 18, it must have felt like a door closing as much as one opening. The person who felt that closing acutely was Princess Rhaenyra. The princess and Alicent had grown up together, shared the same lessons, whispered the same secrets, and navigated the same treacherous currents of court life. Rhaenyra had lost her mother only a year earlier, and now her closest companion was being taken from her in a different way. Alicent was not dying, but she was becoming something else. She was becoming a stepmother. She was becoming a rival. And in the quiet moments that followed the announcement, Rhaenyra understood that the friendship they had shared could never survive the transformation. The court understood it too. The lords and ladies of King's Landing had long memories, and they knew that a new queen meant new possibilities. Viserys was still a relatively young man. There was every reason to believe that Alicent would give him sons, and those sons would be born into a world where their father had already named a female heir. The succession, which had seemed settled when Rhaenyra was named Princess of Dragonstone, suddenly looked fragile again. The realm had never been ruled by a queen in her own right, and now the king's new marriage might produce male claimants who could challenge that precedent. The wedding itself was a quiet affair by royal standards. There was no great tourney, no week of feasting, no elaborate procession through the streets of the capital. Viserys was still in mourning, and the court was still adjusting to the new configuration of power, but the ceremony was performed nonetheless, in the light of the seven-pointed star, with the High Septon himself presiding. Alicent Hightower became Alicent Targaryen, Queen Consort of the Seven Kingdoms and the second Queen of Viserys I. In the months that followed, the new queen settled into her role with a composure that impressed even her critics. She attended council meetings, managed the household, and began the delicate work of building her own network of allies. She was not a woman given to loud declarations or dramatic gestures. Her power was quieter, built on access and patience, and the slow accumulation of influence. She knew that her position depended entirely on the king's favour, and she guarded that favour with the same care that her father guarded the realm. But the shadow of the succession never lifted. Rhaenyra remained the named heir, and the princess made no secret of her resentment. The two women who had once been friends now circled each other in the corridors of the Red Keep, exchanging polite words that carried the weight of unspoken accusations. The court divided itself into factions, though the lines were not yet drawn in green and black. That would come later. For now, the tension was personal, familial, and contained within the walls of the castle. And yet, the seeds of the great conflict had been planted. In 106 AC, Viserys announced that he would marry Alicent Hightower rather than Laena Velaryon. That decision, made in grief and guided by the counsel of a father who saw opportunity in his daughter's proximity to the throne, set in motion a chain of events that would eventually tear the Targaryen dynasty apart. The marriage elevated Alicent from the Hand's daughter to Queen Consort, but it also elevated her children, when they came, to a position of potential rivalry with the princess who had once called her friend. Rhaenyra felt betrayed, and she was not wrong to feel that way. The friendship she had shared with Alicent had been genuine, or at least as genuine as anything can be, in a court where every relationship carries political weight. But the betrayal was not personal in the way that Rhaenyra experienced it. It was structural. It was the logic of dynastic marriage, asserting itself over the bonds of childhood. Alicent had not chosen to become the king's wife in order to hurt Rhaenyra. She had been chosen, and she had accepted, because the alternative was to refuse the crown, and in the world of the Red Keep, refusal was not a safe option. The court realised, almost immediately, that Viserys' new marriage might produce sons whose claims would challenge the named heir, and that realisation hung over every subsequent decision, every whispered conversation, every glance exchanged between the queen and the princess. The future was not yet written, but the ink was already on the page. The dance of the dragons had not begun, but its first steps had been taken, and the woman who would become the heart of the Green faction was already learning the language of power that would define the rest of her life. The marriage of King Viserys I to Alicent Hightower in 106 AC was celebrated with feasts and tournaments that lasted the better part of a fortnight, but the true weight of that union would not be felt until nearly a year later, when the Queen's body began to change in ways court understood immediately. By the autumn of 107 AC, Alicent was with child. The pregnancy was watched closely by every faction in King's Landing. The lords who had murmured about Viserys needing a male heir now had a new focus for their hopes. Queen Aemma had given the king only one surviving child, a daughter, and her final pregnancy had ended in blood and grief. If Alicent could do what Aemma could not, the entire shape of the succession would shift. Alicent carried the child through the long months with the discipline expected of a Hightower. She attended court when required, kept to her chambers when advised, and received the counsel of maesters who had attended royal births for decades. Her father, Otto, visited often, his presence a quiet reminder of what was at stake. He spoke of the realm's need for stability, of the lords who had sworn oaths to Rhaenyra, but would feel those oaths differently if a son were born. He did not need to say more. Alicent understood. The birth came in the dead of winter, in the first month of 108 AC. The labour was long but not dangerous, and the child emerged healthy and strong. The maester announced that the Queen had delivered a son. The name was chosen quickly, with the king's approval, Aegon. It was a name heavy with history, the name of the conqueror himself, the dragon who had united the Seven Kingdoms under Targaryen rule. The news spread through the Red Keep within hours, and from there to the streets of King's Landing, and then by Raven to every corner of the realm. The king had a son. The male heir that so many had expected Viserys to produce was now a living, breathing infant, swaddled in silk and lying in a cradle beside his mother's bed. Otto Hightower understood immediately what this meant. He had spent years positioning himself and his family within the court, and now the foundation of that position had been transformed. A daughter on the throne was one thing. A grandson who could one day sit the Iron Throne was something else entirely. He began to speak in council meetings about the importance of a clear succession, about the dangers of divided loyalties, about the wisdom of naming a son over a daughter when the realm's stability was at stake. He did not openly challenge Rhaenyra's position, not yet, but the seed had been planted. Viserys, however, refused to move. When Otto and other lords suggested that the birth of Prince Aegon might warrant a reconsideration of the succession, the king grew cold. He had named Rhaenyra his heir after the death of Queen Aemma, and he had made the lords of the realm swear oaths to her. He would not break those oaths. He would not disinherit his daughter. Rhaenyra was his firstborn, his only child by Aemma, and he had chosen her for reasons that went beyond tradition. He saw in her the fire of old Valyria, the will to rule, the blood of the dragon. He would not set her aside for a newborn, even if that newborn was his son. Alicent heard the king's words from her bed, where she was still recovering from the birth. She held Aegon in her arms and listened as Viserys explained his decision to the small council. He spoke of duty and honour and the sacred nature of oaths. He spoke of Rhaenyra's training, her education, her readiness. He did not mention the queen or her son, beyond acknowledging that Aegon was a prince of the realm, beloved and cherished, but not the heir. Alicent said nothing. She was caught between two forces that could not be reconciled. On one side stood the king, her husband, the man she had been sent to comfort and serve, whose will she had sworn to uphold. On the other side stood her son, the child she had carried and birthed, whose future was now uncertain. Every instinct told her that a son should inherit before a daughter. That was the law of the Seven Kingdoms, the custom of House Hightower, the expectation of every lord who had ever bent the knee. But Viserys had made his choice, and his word was law. The court began to divide along lines that had not existed before. Those who had always favoured Rhaenyra saw the birth of Aegon as a threat to her claim, and they rallied around her more fiercely. Those who had never been comfortable with the idea of a ruling queen saw the prince as the rightful heir, and they began to whisper that the king's decision was unnatural, that it would lead to chaos after his death. The whispers grew louder as the months passed, and the factions began to take shape. Alicent watched it all from the nursery, where she spent her days with Aegon, and soon after, with a second child, a daughter named Helena, born in 109 AC. She was a mother now, and that identity was becoming inseparable from her role as queen. Every decision she made, every word she spoke, every alliance she formed would be measured against the interests of her children. She had not asked for this position. She had been placed in it by her father, by the king, by the circumstances of her birth and marriage. But now that she was in it, she could not simply step aside. The green gown that Alicent wore to the tourney in 111 AC was not a political statement when she chose it. It was simply a gown, a beautiful piece of silk and velvet in a shade that suited her colouring. But when she appeared in the royal box, seated beside the king, with her children around her, the colour caught the eye of every lord and lady in the stands. The Hightower colours were green, and the queen was a Hightower. The symbolism was impossible to ignore, and from that day forward, the faction that supported Aegon's claim would be known as the Greens. The king did not seem to notice. He was already beginning to fail, his body ravaged by the slow decay of a disease that left him in constant pain. He leaned on Alicent more heavily with each passing year, and she gave him the support he needed, attending to his needs, managing his schedule, softening the edges of his temper. She was a good wife by all accounts, and Viserys was grateful. But gratitude did not change his mind about the succession. Alicent's position grew more complicated as her children grew older. Aegon was a bright boy, but he was also willful and prone to the arrogance that came with being a prince. Helena was quiet and gentle, more interested in insects and prophecies than in court politics. Aemond, born in 110 AC, was sharp and determined, hungry for recognition, and Daeron, the youngest, was sent to Oldtown to be fostered, a decision that removed him from the immediate drama of the capital, but also placed him firmly within the Hightower sphere of influence. Each child was a piece on a board that was being set for a war no one wanted to name. Alicent knew this. She saw the way Otto looked at Aegon, the way he spoke of the boy's future, the way he calculated every move. She saw the way Rhaenyra's supporters bristled at any mention of the prince. She saw the way the king's health declined, and she knew that the day would come when his will would be tested by forces he could no longer control. For now, she held the line. She was the queen, the mother of the king's sons, the keeper of his household and his confidence. She would not challenge his decision openly. She would not undermine his authority, but she would protect her children. She would ensure that they were not forgotten, that their claims were not dismissed, that their futures were not sacrificed to a promise made before they were born. The court continued its slow dance around the succession, and the Greens and the Blacks began to solidify into the factions that would one day tear the realm apart. In those early years, the conflict was still a matter of words and glances, of whispered conversations in corridors, of letters sent and received in secret. The dragon still slept in the dragon pit, and the war was still a shadow on the horizon. Alicent held her son Aegon in her arms and looked out over the city from the windows of Maegor's Holdfast. She was the queen of the Seven Kingdoms, the mother of a prince, the daughter of a hand, and the wife of a dying king. She had done everything that had been asked of her, and she would do everything that would be asked of her in the years to come. The path was not of her choosing, but she would walk it nonetheless, step by step, until the end. The birth of Prince Aegon did not, as some in the court had hoped, settle the question of succession. If anything, it made the uncertainty worse. Viserys had spent years refusing to name a definitive heir after the death of his first son, Balon. He had let the realm assume that Rhaenyra, his only surviving child from Queen Aemma, would one day sit the Iron Throne. But now there was a boy, a healthy, living son. And that son had a mother who was the daughter of the Hand of the King. Alicent understood what her position required of her. She had been raised in the Red Keep, had watched her father navigate the shifting loyalties of the court. She knew that a queen's value was measured in the children she gave the king, and she had given him a son. But one son was not enough. The Targaryen dynasty had always relied on numbers, on having enough dragons and enough heirs to survive the inevitable losses. So Alicent did what was expected. She continued to share the king's bed, and she continued to bear his children. The second child came in the year 107 after Aegon's conquest, a daughter. They named her Helaena. She was a quiet child from the beginning, with a dreamy quality that some at court mistook for simplicity. But those who watched her closely noticed that she often spoke of things before they happened, as if she could see the threads of time more clearly than others. The maesters would later describe her as having a gift for prophecy, though, in the Red Keep, such gifts were as much a burden as a blessing. Then came Aemond, born in 110. He was fierce where Aegon was lazy, sharp where Helaena was soft. From the moment he could walk, he wanted to be noticed, he wanted to be feared, and he wanted a dragon. The children of the royal family were expected to claim dragons of their own, and Aemond watched his older brother and sister bond with their hatchlings with an intensity that bordered on obsession. But the dragons of the younger generation were not always easy to tame, and Aemond's patience was not yet as strong as his ambition. The last of Alicent's children with Viserys was Daeron, born several years later. He was sent to Oldtown as a ward, to be raised in the shadow of the Hightower itself, among the maesters and the septons. This was not unusual. Noble children were often fostered in the households of powerful lords, but it meant that Daeron grew up apart from his siblings, a prince of the realm who was more familiar with the libraries of the Citadel than the intrigues of the Red Keep. In the years to come, that distance would matter. While Alicent built her family, Rhaenyra was making her own alliances. The princess had been named heir to the Iron Throne, but her position was fragile. She needed powerful supporters, and the most powerful supporter she could find was the Velaryon fleet. Lord Corlys Velaryon, the Sea Snake, had made House Velaryon the wealthiest family in the Seven Kingdoms. His ships controlled the trade routes of the Narrow Sea. His dragons were among the oldest and largest in the realm, and he had a son, Lynor, who was of an age with Rhaenyra. The match was arranged. In 114, after Aegon's conquest, Rhaenyra Targaryen married Sir Laenor Velaryon in a ceremony that was meant to unite two great houses and secure the succession. The wedding was held on Driftmark, the seat of House Velaryon, and it was attended by nearly every lord of consequence in the realm. The king himself presided, though by then his health was beginning to fail. He walked with a limp, his body ravaged by the same slow decay that had taken so many Targaryens before him. But he smiled as he watched his daughter exchange vows with the young knight, and he believed, perhaps, that he had done enough to protect her future. The marriage tied the royal succession to the Velaryon fleet in a way that could not be undone. If Rhaenyra ever claimed the throne, she would do so with the full backing of the most powerful navy in Westeros. Lord Corlys had spent his life building that fleet, and he would not let it be wasted. He saw in Rhaenyra a continuation of his own ambition, a chance to see his bloodline sit the Iron Throne for generations to come. But every marriage and every birth created another branch of the family with something to lose. Rhaenyra's children with Lynor would be Velaryons in name, but they would carry Targaryen blood, they would have claims, and they would have dragons. And Alicent's children, the children of the king's second marriage, would have claims of their own. The Red Keep, which had once been a single household under the rule of Viserys, began to fracture. It became less a home than a collection of rival courts living under one roof. On one side, there was the Queen's apartments. Alicent surrounded herself with the wives of powerful lords, with septons who preached the doctrines of the faith, with knights who had sworn their swords to the protection of the king's true-born sons. They gathered in her chambers, speaking in low voices, planning for a future that did not include Rhaenyra. They called themselves the Greens, after the colour of the gown Alicent had worn to a tourney years before. A gown that had been a deliberate statement of her presence at court. On the other side, there was the princess's household. Rhaenyra kept her own court, filled with young lords who admired her spirit, with dragon riders who respected her blood, with those who believed that the king's word should be law. They gathered in the Stone Drum, the ancient tower of the Red Keep, and they spoke of duty and honour and the sacred bond between a father and his chosen heir. They called themselves the Blacks, after the colours of House Targaryen, and they saw themselves as the true defenders of the dynasty. Between them stood the king. Viserys was not blind to the growing tension. He saw the cold glances exchanged in the corridors. He heard the whispers that followed his daughter and his wife, wherever they went, that he was tired. The crown had weighed heavily on him for decades, and his body was failing. He chose to believe that the divisions would heal with time, that his family would find a way to reconcile. He chose to believe that his love for Rhaenyra and his duty to Alicent could exist in the same space without tearing the realm apart. He was wrong. The Red Keep became a place of silences. The great hall, where the court once gathered for feasts and celebrations, grew quieter. The gardens, where Rhaenyra and Alicent had once walked as friends, were now avoided by both women. They could not be in the same room without the air growing thick with unspoken accusations. And the children, the young princes and princesses who should have been cousins and companions, learned to see each other as rivals. Aegon, the firstborn son of the Queen, grew up knowing that he was supposed to be king. He heard it from his mother, from his grandfather, from every lord who knelt before him. But he also heard that his half-sister had been named heir, that the king had chosen her over him. He did not understand why, and the confusion festered into resentment. He was not a cruel boy, not at first. He was simply a boy who had been told. He was owed something he could not have. Aemond, the second son, watched his brother struggle with the weight of expectation and decided that he would be different. He would not wait for the crown to be handed to him. He would take what he wanted, and what he wanted, more than anything, was a dragon. The great beasts of the Targaryen dynasty were symbols of power, and without one, Aemond felt incomplete. He would spend his childhood searching for a dragon to claim, and that search would lead him to a moment that changed everything. Helena, the quiet daughter, saw the cracks forming in her family and tried to hold them together with gentle words and soft smiles. But her prophecies, when they came, were not always kind. She spoke of blood and fire, of a war that would consume them all. Her mother listened, and her mother worried. But there was nothing either of them could do to stop what was coming. And Daeron, the youngest, grew up far from the Red Keep, in the city of Oldtown, where the Hightower cast its long shadow over the harbour. He learned the ways of the Reach, the chivalry of the South, the courtesies of the faith. He was raised to be a loyal son of House Targaryen, but he was also raised to be a weapon, a prince who could be called upon when the time came. The time would come. The king was growing weaker, and the court was growing bolder. The factions that had formed around Alicent and Rhaenyra were no longer content to wait. They wanted answers. They wanted guarantees. They wanted to know who would sit the Iron Throne when Viserys finally closed his eyes for the last time. But the king refused to give them those answers. He clung to the hope that his family could find peace, that the love he felt for his daughter and his wife would somehow bridge the divide. He did not see that the divide was already too wide. He did not see that the Red Keep, which had once been a home, had become a battlefield. And so the years passed. The children grew. The dragons multiplied. And the court waited, holding its breath, for the moment when the king would die, and the dance of the dragons would begin. By the time Rhaenyra married Sir Laenor Velaryon, the court of King Viserys I had already begun to feel like a stage where two performances were being rehearsed. On one side stood the Queen and her growing family. On the other stood the princess and her allies, and between them sat a king who seemed determined to look the other way. For years, the tension had been a matter of whispered conversations in corridors and carefully worded letters between lords. But in the year 111 after Aegon's conquest, that tension found a visible form. It happened at a tourney, one of those grand displays of chivalry and pageantry that the court loved so much. And it began with a gown. Alicent Hightower arrived at the tournament grounds dressed in green. Not just any green, but a shade that matched the colour of the beacon that burned atop the Hightower in Oldtown. The signal fire that had guided ships to the city for centuries. It was the colour of her house, the colour of her father's ambition, and the colour of the faith that had shaped her upbringing. She wore it as if she meant to be seen, and she was. The green silk caught the sunlight as she took her seat in the royal box, and every eye in the stands followed her. It was a deliberate choice, though whether it was Alicent's own decision or one made by her father and his allies, the histories do not say. What matters is the effect it had. Rhaenyra arrived shortly after, and she too had chosen her colours with care. She wore black and red, the colours of House Targaryen, the dragon's colours, the colours of the blood that ran in her veins, and the throne she had been promised. Where Alicent's green was a statement of house loyalty, Rhaenyra's black and red was a statement of birthright. She was not simply a princess of the realm. She was the heir to the Iron Throne, and her clothing reminded everyone of that fact. The two women sat in the same royal box, separated by a few feet of carved wood and a gulf of unspoken resentment. The knights below them clashed in the lists, lances splintering against shields, but the real contest was happening in the stands. The tourney itself was a grand affair, the kind of event that drew lords and ladies from across the Seven Kingdoms. There were feasts and dances and all the usual entertainments, but what people remembered afterward was not the winner of the joust or the champion of the melee. What they remembered was the green gown and the black and red dress. In the days that followed, the court began to divide itself along those colours. Those who supported Queen Alicent and her children, especially her son Aegon, began to call themselves the Greens. Those who supported Princess Rhaenyra and her claim to the throne began to call themselves the Blacks. What had been a private dispute between a stepmother and a stepdaughter, between a queen and an heir, now had public banners. And once a dispute has banners, it is very difficult to put away. The naming was not official, of course. No decree was issued. No council voted on it. It was simply what people began to say in the taverns and the courtyards and the great halls of the Red Keep. Are you a green or a black? The question spread from King's Landing to the rest of the realm, carried by knights returning home from the tourney, and by ravens bearing letters from lords who had been present. Within months, the colours had become shorthand for a political alignment that cut across old loyalties and created new ones. The Greens were the faction of the court, the established order, the Queen and her father, and the lords who believed that a son should always come before a daughter. The Blacks were the faction of the heir, the princess and her husband, and the lords who believed that an oath was an oath, sworn before gods and men. And yet, for all the symbolism of that day, it is worth remembering that Alicent and Rhaenyra had once been friends. They had grown up together in the same castle, shared secrets and laughter, and trusted each other in ways that the court had never fully understood. That friendship had been broken by ambition and duty, and the slow accumulation of grievances that neither woman could forgive. The green gown was not the cause of that break. It was a symptom. It was the moment when what had been hidden became visible, when the court could no longer pretend that the Queen and the Princess were anything but rivals. The years that followed the tourney of 111 saw the division deepen. The Greens gathered around Queen Alicent, who by then had given the king 3 healthy children. Aegon was a boy of 5, already being trained in the arts of war and statecraft. Helena was a quiet girl who loved insects and riddles. Aemond was a fierce child with a temper that matched his uncle Daemon's. And there was another son, Daeron, still young but growing. Each child was a brick in the wall that separated the Queen's family from the princess's claim. The Blacks, for their part, rallied around Rhaenyra, who had given birth to sons of her own. Jacaerys, Lucerys, and Joffrey Velaryon bore their father's name but carried their mother's blood. They were the heirs to the heir, and their existence strengthened Rhaenyra's position, even as it complicated the succession further. King Viserys remained on the throne, but his health was failing. He had grown fat and sickly, plagued by sores and fevers that left him bedridden for days at a time. He still loved his daughter, and he still insisted that she was his heir, but he also loved his wife, and he could not bring himself to discipline her faction or to silence the whispers that surrounded his son. The king's indecision was a kind of decision in itself. By refusing to choose between his daughter and his wife, he allowed both sides to believe that they might win, and so the court continued to divide, the Greens and the Blacks growing more entrenched with each passing year. The green gown had done its work. It had given a name to the conflict and a colour to the cause. From that day forward, no one could pretend that the unity of the royal family was anything but a fragile illusion. The tourney had ended, the knights had gone home, and the banners had been furled, but the colours remained, stitched into the fabric of the court and the memory of the realm. The tourney of 111 AC had drawn a line through the Red Keep, a line visible in silk and satin. From that day forward, the court understood that the Queen and the Princess were not simply distant, but opposed, and yet for a time the realm held its breath. The king still ruled, the succession was still named, and Rhaenyra, the heir to the Iron Throne, was now a married woman. Her union with Sir Lyonor Velaryon had been a political necessity, a marriage meant to bind the crown to the sea power of Driftmark. But the marriage was not a happy one in the private sense. Laenor was a man of good heart and considerable skill as a knight, but his desires did not lie with women. The court knew this, though few spoke of it openly, and so the question of heirs became a question of blood. Rhaenyra gave birth to 3 sons. The first was Jacaerys, born in 114 AC. The second was Lucerys, born a year later, and the third was Joffrey, born in 117 AC. They were strong, healthy boys with the brown hair and brown eyes of their mother's rumoured lover, Sir Harwin Strong. They did not look like Lyonor Velaryon, who was pale-haired and purple-eyed in the true Valyrian tradition. They did not look like Rhaenyra, whose silver-gold hair was unmistakably Targaryen. They looked like Harwin Strong. The court whispered. It was not a subtle whisper. It was the kind of rumour that filled the corridors of the Red Keep, that passed between lords and ladies at supper, that found its way into the ears of the Queen. And Alicent Hightower listened. She had always listened. She had learned, in the years since her marriage, that information was the most valuable currency a queen could possess, and the information about Rhaenyra's sons was damaging. Alicent saw the rumours not as gossip, but as evidence. Evidence that Rhaenyra's line was compromised. Evidence that the heir to the Iron Throne was passing off bastards as true-born Velaryons. Evidence that the succession, which Viserys had so carefully protected, was built on a foundation of lies. To Alicent, this was not a matter of personal spite. It was a matter of law. It was a matter of faith. The 7 kingdoms had always held that a child born of a marriage was the child of the husband, but only if the husband was the father in truth. If the blood was false, the claim was false, and if Rhaenyra's sons were not Laenor's, then they were not heirs to anything. She raised the matter with Viserys. She did so carefully, as she had learned to do over the years. She did not accuse. She did not demand. She simply presented the whispers as a concern, a cloud over the succession that the king might wish to clear. But Viserys would not hear it. He refused to entertain any public challenge to his daughter or his grandchildren. He loved Rhaenyra. He had named her heir against all tradition, and he would not see her undermined by rumour. He told Alicent that the boys were Lyonor's sons, that the matter was closed and that she should not speak of it again. But the matter was not closed. It could not be closed, because every time the boys appeared at court, the whispers grew louder. Every time a lord looked at Jacaerys and saw the face of Harwin Strong, the doubt deepened. And every time Alicent saw her own children, her Aegon and Helena and Aemond, she saw the contrast. Her children looked like Targaryens. They had the silver hair, the violet eyes, the unmistakable stamp of the dragon's blood. Rhaenyra's sons looked like Strongs. The resentment among the Greens deepened. Otto Hightower, who had been dismissed as Hand of the King, but remained a powerful voice in the shadows, counselled patience. He told Alicent that the truth would out, that the realm would see what it saw, and that when the time came, the question of blood would be impossible to ignore. But patience was difficult when the king refused to see what was plain. Viserys was not blind, he was not foolish. He was simply unwilling to admit that his daughter had made a choice that endangered the succession. He loved her too much to see her fall, and so the court remained divided. The blacks and the greens circled each other like wolves in winter, each waiting for the moment when the old king would finally pass. Rhaenyra withdrew to Dragonstone with her sons and her husband, leaving the Red Keep to the whispers and the scheming. She had her dragons, she had her claim, she had the king's word, but she did not have the court, and she did not have the faith of the queen. Alicent, for her part, did not rest. She watched, she waited, she gathered information. She knew that the truth of Rhaenyra's sons was not a secret that could be kept forever. She knew that one day the realm would have to choose, and she knew that when that day came, the question of blood would be the question that decided everything. The years passed, the boys grew. Jacaerys became a clever and capable young man, beloved by those who knew him. Lucerys was brave if impulsive. Joffrey was still a child, but he showed the same strong features as his brothers, and the whispers never stopped. They were the background hum of the court, the sound that never quite faded, and in the Queen's chambers, Alicent Hightower listened to that hum and waited for the moment when it would become a roar. By the time Rhaenyra's 3 sons, Jacaerys, Lucerys and Joffrey, had grown old enough to walk the halls of the Red Keep, the whispers had hardened into something more dangerous. The boys had brown hair, brown eyes, and features that resembled Sir Harwin Strong far more than they did Sir Lionel Velaryon. And in a court where bloodlines were the foundation of every claim, those whispers were not idle gossip. They were political ammunition. Alicent Hightower watched these developments with a growing sense of alarm that she could no longer disguise as concern for the realm. She had spent years trying to secure her children's futures within a system that had never fully accepted them as legitimate heirs. Now, with Rhaenyra's standing as the next generation of the royal line, the question of blood had become a question of survival. It was not simply that Rhaenyra's children might be bastards. It was that if they were, then the entire Targaryen succession rested on a lie. And if that lie was exposed, what would happen to the children of the true-born queen? What would happen to Aegon, to Helena, to Aemond, and to Daeron? Alicent's political identity had become inseparable from protecting them. Every move she made at court, every alliance she cultivated, every word she spoke in council chambers was aimed at one goal: ensuring that her children would not be swept aside when Viserys finally passed. She had seen what happened to rivals in the Game of Thrones. She had read the histories. When a new monarch took the throne, the old king's other children were often removed, sometimes quietly, sometimes violently. Rhaenyra had been named heir, but she was not a traditional choice. If she became queen, would she tolerate the existence of her half-brothers and half-sister, who had been raised in the same castle, who had been groomed as alternatives? Alicent feared that if Rhaenyra ascended the Iron Throne, her own children would become threats to be removed. That fear was not baseless. The precedent of the Dance of the Dragons had not yet been written. But the logic of power was clear. A queen who had struggled to secure her own claim would not leave potential rivals alive. And so Alicent began to frame every political debate not as a question of law, but as a question of safety. When she argued that Aegon should be named heir, she was not simply asserting a legal principle. She was trying to build a wall around her children. But Rhaenyra saw the situation from the opposite side. Every demand from the Greens, every call for a great council, every suggestion that Viserys reconsider his choice, every rumour about the Strong Boys felt like an attack on her own inheritance. Rhaenyra feared that every Green demand was an attempt to strip her of the inheritance Viserys had promised her, and she was not wrong. The Greens did want to overturn the succession. They did believe that a male heir, especially one born of the king's second marriage, was more legitimate than a female heir, especially one whose children were rumoured to be bastards. So the court became a battlefield of suspicion. Alicent and Rhaenyra, once friends, now barely spoke. When they did, the words were sharp and laden with unspoken accusations. The conflict was no longer merely about legal principles. It was about the survival of two families. Each woman believed that the other's victory would mean the destruction of everything she loved. Alicent began to surround herself with allies who shared her fears. Her father, Otto Hightower, still the hand of the king, was her most trusted counsellor. He'd always understood the stakes. He had been the one to whisper that Aegon's birth changed everything. Now he whispered that the time for patience was running out. The longer Viserys lived, the more entrenched Rhaenyra's position became, and the more Rhaenyra's sons grew, the harder it would be to challenge their legitimacy. But Alicent also found unexpected support among the lords of the realm. Many of them had never been comfortable with the idea of a ruling queen. They saw Aegon as the rightful heir by tradition, by custom, by the laws of the Seven Kingdoms that had always favoured sons over daughters. And they saw the Strong Boys as an insult to the bloodline. The whispers in the Great Hall were not just rumours. They were the seeds of a rebellion that had not yet been named. Meanwhile, Rhaenyra retreated to Dragonstone more and more often. She surrounded herself with her own loyalists, her husband Aemond, her sons, the Velaryon fleet. She knew that the Greens were building a faction, and she knew that her father's health was failing. The question was no longer whether there would be a conflict. The question was when it would begin, and so the two mothers prepared. Alicent taught Aegon to speak of duty and destiny, even as she saw his reluctance. She watched Aemond train with a blade, knowing that he would need to be stronger than his brother. She held Helena close, knowing that the gentle girl would be a pawn in a game she did not understand, and she wrote letters to Daeron, who had been sent to Oldtown as a ward, hoping that the distance would keep him safe. Rhaenyra too prepared. She drilled her sons in the histories of their house, reminding them that they were dragons, not sheep. She strengthened her alliances with the lords of the Narrow Sea, and she waited for the moment when her father's hand would finally let go of the throne. The court of King's Landing had become a house divided against itself. Every feast, every council meeting, every casual conversation carried the weight of unspoken war. The two families that had once been one family now looked at each other across a chasm that could not be bridged. And at the centre of it all stood Alicent Hightower, a mother who had learned that in this world, love for her children meant preparing for the worst. She had not chosen this path. She had been placed on it by her father, by her marriage, by the birth of her sons. But now she walked it with the grim certainty of someone who had no other road. The Greens were not just a faction, they were her family, and she would do whatever it took to keep them alive. The question of blood had become a question of survival, and the answer, when it came, would be written in fire and blood. Before we dive deeper into this incredible journey, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop a comment below and let our global community know. And if you're finding this as mind-blowing as I am, hit that like button to help more people discover this story. The death of Laena Velaryon came not in battle, nor in childbirth, but by her own hand. On the island of Driftmark, In the year 120 after Aegon's conquest, Lyanna, the wife of Prince Daemon Targaryen, grew desperate in her final labour. The child would not come, and the pain became unbearable. She commanded her dragon Vhagar to end her suffering. Vhagar, the largest living dragon in the world, obeyed. Lyanna was consumed by flame, and the royal family gathered on Driftmark beneath the shadow of grief. The funeral was held by the sea, on the shores of Driftmark, where the tides of Blackwater Bay met the ancient stones of the Velaryon fortress. The pyre was built, and Lyanna's body was laid upon it. Her daughters, Baela and Rhaena, stood beside their father, Prince Daemon, their faces pale and tear-streaked. The Targaryen family had come from King's Landing. King Viserys, frail and weary, leaning on his cane, Queen Alicent, her green gown replaced by mourning black, and their children, Aegon, Helaena and Aemond. Rhaenyra arrived with her husband, Lyonor Velaryon, and their 3 sons, Jaehaerys, Lucerys and Joffrey. The air was thick with salt and smoke, and the only sound was the crackling of the pyre and the distant crash of waves. It was during this gathering, in the quiet aftermath of the funeral, that a young prince made a decision that would echo through the coming war. Aemond Targaryen, the second son of Alicent and Viserys, was only 10 years old. He had no dragon of his own, unlike his siblings and cousins. Aegon had Sunfire, Alina had Dreamfire, and Rhaenyra's sons each had their own hatchlings. But Aemond was dragonless, and he felt the sting of that absence keenly. That night, while the adults mourned and the castle slept, Aemond slipped away from his chambers. He walked through the darkened halls of High Tide, the Velaryon seat, and made his way to the dragon pit, where the great beasts were kept. Vhagar, the dragon of Lyanna and before her, of the legendary Queen Visenya, was restless. She had lost her rider, and her grief was a living thing, a fury waiting to be channeled. Aemond approached her, speaking the words of the dragon lords in High Valyrian. He climbed onto her back, and Vhagar did not burn him. She accepted him. Aemond claimed Vhagar, the greatest living dragon, gaining immense power but enraging Lyanna's daughters. Baela and Rhaena, who had grown up with Vhagar as their mother's dragon, felt theft as a betrayal. They confronted Aemond the next morning, and the confrontation turned violent. The fight broke out on the beach, among the rocks and the tide pools. Baela and Rhaena, along with Jaehaerys and Lucerys Velaryon, cornered Aemond. Words were exchanged, accusations of theft and insults about the parentage of Rhaenyra's sons. Aemond, in his arrogance, called Lucerys and Jaehaerys Strongs, a slur that questioned their true father. That was the spark. Lucerys, only 7 years old, drew a knife. In the scuffle that followed, Aemond was struck in the face. The blade cut deep and he lost his left eye. The children scattered, blood staining the sand. The aftermath was chaos. Aemond was brought to the maester, his wound dressed, but the eye was gone. Queen Alicent, upon seeing her son's face, was consumed by a fury that had been building for years. She demanded justice for her son, while Rhaenyra demanded that the questioning of her children's parentage stop. The two women faced each other in the great hall of High Tide, King Viserys seated between them, his health failing, his authority crumbling. Alicent spoke first, her voice trembling with rage. She insisted that Lucerys must be punished, that an eye for an eye was the only justice. She pointed at Rhaenyra and accused her of raising children who were bastards, who had no right to the throne. Rhaenyra, in turn, demanded that the king silence those who spread such rumours. She argued that Aemond had provoked the attack, that he had stolen a dragon and then insulted her sons. The king, weary and desperate for peace, tried to mediate. He ordered that the matter be dropped, that no further punishment be given, and that the parentage of Rhaenyra's children never be questioned again. But his words were hollow. The wound was not only physical. Alicent in that moment crossed a line. She rose from her seat, walked to the king's throne, and in front of the entire court, she drew a dagger. She lunged toward Rhaenyra, but was stopped by Sir Criston Cole, the Lord Commander of the King's Guard. The king, shocked and furious, ordered her to stand down, but the damage was done. The mask of courtly decorum had slipped. Alicent's grief for her son had turned into a declaration of war. That night on Driftmark, the royal family fractured beyond repair. Aemond, now one-eyed and bonded to the largest dragon in the world, became a symbol of the Green faction's rising power. Rhaenyra's sons, marked as bastards by the court's whispers, grew more isolated, and Alicent, standing in the torchlight, her green dress now stained with the blood of her own ambition, knew that the path forward would be paved with fire. The funeral of Lyanna Velaryon had become the funeral of peace itself. From that moment, the court of King Viserys was no longer a place of unity. It was a stage for two queens, each convinced that the other's children were a threat to everything they loved. And as the years passed, the wounds of Driftmark would fester, until the only cure left was the Dance of the Dragons. The night on Driftmark did not end with the claiming of Vargar. The great dragon had been settled, a new rider Aemond, standing in the torchlight with a satisfaction that bordered on triumph. But the children of Lyanna Velaryon, Baela and Rhaena, had lost their mother only hours before, and now they had lost her dragon too. The grief that had hung over the funeral turned sharp and immediate. Baela confronted Aemond. Words were exchanged, then fists. Then the other children were drawn in. Luke, Jace, and even the young Joffrey joined the fray. In the chaos, Aemond was struck with a rock, and he lost an eye. The wound was severe, the blood streaming down his face as he staggered back into the hall where the adults had gathered. And that is where the fracture became a chasm. Alicent had been sitting with Viserys, the king exhausted from the journey and the weight of the funeral. When she saw her son stumble in, his face half covered in red, something inside her broke. She did not ask for explanations. She did not wait for the king to speak. She saw the eye socket, the empty space where an eye had been, and she saw the children of Rhaenyra standing nearby, their knuckles bruised, their faces defiant. In that moment, years of courtly restraint, the careful words, the measured smiles, the silent endurance of Rhaenyra's favour and her father's ambition, all of it collapsed. Alicent moved with a speed that surprised everyone. She crossed the room to where Viserys sat, and she took the dagger from his belt. The blade was Valyrian steel, a relic of the Conqueror, and it caught the firelight as she turned. She lunged at Rhaenyra. The princess did not have time to react. The blade caught her arm, slicing through the fabric of her sleeve and drawing blood. It was not a deep wound, but it was a visible one, a mark that could not be hidden. The friendship that had once been the foundation of their youth was now written in red on Rhaenyra's skin. Guards moved. Voices rose. Viserys shouted for peace, his voice cracking with age and desperation. He commanded that the matter be settled, that the children be reconciled, that the family hold together. But his words were hollow. The king could order silence, but he could not order trust. He could command the court to pretend, but he could not heal what had been broken. The incident on Driftmark revealed something that had been simmering for years. The women at the centre of the succession dispute were no longer pretending to trust one another. Alicent had shown her hand. She had chosen violence. She had chosen her son over the crown princess. And Rhaenyra, nursing her wounded arm, understood that the pretense of friendship was over. The night ended with a fragile truce, but the fracture inside the family was now a visible scar. The king returned to his chambers, his health failing, his authority slipping. Alicent retreated to her quarters with Aemond, her rage still burning, and Rhaenyra, standing in the corridor with her own children, knew that the next time they met, it would not be with words. The dagger had been drawn, the blood had been spilled, and the Dance of the Dragons, though not yet named, had begun its slow, inevitable march. In the days that followed, the court at King's Landing became a place of whispered alliances and hidden glances. The king's command for unity was obeyed in public, but ignored in private. Lord Corlys Velaryon, still grieving his daughter, withdrew to his chambers and spoke little. Rhaenys, the queen who never was, watched the proceedings with a knowing sadness. She had seen this before. She had seen families tear themselves apart for a throne. She had seen the cost of ambition, and she knew, perhaps better than anyone, that the wound inflicted on Driftmark would not heal with time. It would fester. Aemond's injury became a symbol. For the Greens, it was proof of Rhaenyra's children's savagery. For the Blacks, it was the consequence of a boy who had stolen what was not his. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between, but truth had little currency in a court already divided. Alicent began to surround herself more closely with her father's allies. Sir Criston Cole, now Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, became her most trusted confidant. His hatred for Rhaenyra had only deepened since the night of the wedding, and he saw in Alicent's fury a mirror of his own. Together they began to plan, not openly, not yet, but the seeds of conspiracy were sown in the quiet hours of the night, in the corridors where servants did not tread, in the letters sealed with wax and sent to the Reach, to the Stormlands, to the west. Rhaenyra, for her part, returned to Dragonstone with her children. The island fortress had always been her refuge, but now it felt like a cage. She knew what was coming. She could feel it in the way. The wind carried the smoke from the Dragonmont in the restless stirring of Syrax when she flew above the waves. She began to gather her own allies. Daemon was at her side, his patience worn thin, his temper barely leashed. He had wanted to strike back immediately, to mount Caraxes and burn the Red Keep to ash, but Rhaenyra held him back. "Not yet," she said. "Not until we are ready." And so they waited. They trained. They prepared. The realm held its breath. The lords of Westeros watched the crown with wary eyes. Some sent ravens to Dragonstone, pledging their swords. Others sent ravens to the Red Keep, reaffirming their loyalty to the king. But everyone knew that Viserys would not live forever. His health had declined sharply since Driftmark. He coughed blood into his handkerchief. He slept more hours than he woke. And when he did speak, his words were often confused, his commands contradictory. The realm was being steered by a dying man, and the hands that gripped the wheel were not his own. The dance had not yet begun, but the dancers were in position. The music was playing, and soon the first step would be taken. That moment in the throne room, when Alicent lunged at Rhaenyra with Viserys' own dagger and cut her arm, did not end the way either woman might have expected. The king did not punish his wife. He did not banish her. He simply looked at the blood on Rhaenyra's sleeve, looked at the dagger in Alicent's hand, and then he ordered the room cleared. It was as if he believed that, if he stopped acknowledging the wound, it would heal on its own. But Rhaenyra understood what her stepmother's attack meant. The friendship that had once been the foundation of her childhood at court was now nothing but ash, and she knew that if she stayed in King's Landing, the next blade might not miss. So Rhaenyra made a decision that would reshape the realm. She removed herself from the Red Keep entirely. She took her household, her children, and her closest allies and sailed east to Dragonstone. That ancient fortress, carved from volcanic stone and dragonfire, had always been the traditional seat of the Targaryen heir, but now it became something more. Separate court, a rival centre of power, a place where Rhaenyra could rule without the constant pressure of Alicent's gaze and Otto's whispers. She took her sons Jacaerys, Lucerys, and Joffrey. She took her husband Daemon. She took the dragons that belonged to her family, and she left behind the capital that had become a cage. On Dragonstone, Rhaenyra began to govern in her own right. She held court in the Great Hall beneath the carved stone dragons. She received lords who remained loyal to her claim. He raised her children in the shadow of the Dragonmont, where the air smelled of sulphur and the ground trembled with the presence of sleeping dragons. It was a harsher life than the gilded halls of the Red Keep, but it was a life she controlled. She no longer had to smile at Alicent across the council table. She no longer had to watch her father's health decline, while Otto Hightower whispered poison into his ear. She was free in a sense, but freedom on Dragonstone also meant distance. Distance from the king, distance from the levers of power, distance from the daily decisions that shaped the realm. Meanwhile, Alicent remained in King's Landing. She did not retreat. She did not hide. She took the incident with the dagger and used it to solidify her position. She told herself, and she told her father, that she had acted to protect her children, that Rhaenyra's sons were bastards, that Aegon was the true heir, and Otto, ever the strategist, saw the opportunity. He and Alicent began to build influence around the aging king with a careful, relentless precision. They controlled who had access to Viserys. They shaped which petitions reached his ears. They placed loyal men in key positions throughout the court. The king grew weaker, his body ravaged by the same disease that had already taken one of his eyes and most of his strength. And as he faded, the Green faction grew stronger. The royal family was now separated by water, by distance, and by years of accumulated suspicion. Rhaenyra on Dragonstone, Alicent in the Red Keep. Two courts, two visions of the future. Two mothers who believed they were acting to save their children. And between them, the narrow sea, which was not wide enough to keep them apart forever. Letters still passed between the island and the capital, but they were formal, old, stripped of any warmth. Rhaenyra sent reports of her governance, updates on her children, requests for her father's blessing. Alice intercepted many of those letters, or delayed them, or rewrote them before they reached the king. It was a quiet war, fought with ink and seals and carefully chosen words. And through it all, Viserys continued to insist that harmony was possible. He still called Rhaenyra his heir. He still spoke of a great council that would settle all disputes. He still believed that if everyone simply followed the law and respected the succession, the realm would remain at peace. But every arrangement he made, every appointment he approved, every favour he granted to the Hightowers, prepared the kingdom for war. He named Otto Hand of the King once more, giving the Greens control of the small council. He allowed Alicent to sit in on meetings, to advise him on matters of state. He gave his grandsons from Alicent places of honour at court, and he did not see, or would not see, that each of these choices was a nail in the coffin of the peace he claimed to love. The Court of Separate Worlds had become a reality. On Dragonstone, Rhaenyra trained her sons to ride dragons. She strengthened her alliances with the Velaryons, whose fleet was the most powerful in the realm. She waited. On the other side of the water, Alicent raised her own children to believe that the throne was theirs by right. She taught Aegon that he was born to be king. She taught Aemond that he must be strong, must claim a dragon, must never show weakness. She taught Helena to be gentle, to be a queen in waiting, and she taught Daeron, the youngest, to be a soldier. The seeds of war were being watered every day, even as the king insisted that the garden was at peace. The years passed, the seasons turned, the dragons grew larger, and the two courts drifted further apart, each convinced that the other was the enemy. Rhaenyra watched from Dragonstone as her father's health failed, as her stepmother's influence grew, as the realm slowly slipped from her grasp. Alicent watched from the Red Keep as Rhaenyra's power on Dragonstone became more independent, more defiant, more like a rival queen. Neither woman could see a path back to the friendship they had once shared. Neither woman could imagine a future where both their children lived. And so they prepared, each in her own way, for the moment when the harmony that Viserys believed in would shatter. That moment would come, as all such moments do, with a death. But before the king could die, before the war could begin, there were other wounds to be inflicted, other alliances to be forged, other dragons to be claimed. The Court of Separate Worlds was not static. It was a living thing, growing, changing, moving toward a collision that no one could prevent. And in the quiet hours on Dragonstone, when the wind howled through the stone corridors and the sea crashed against the cliffs, Rhaenyra must have known that she was not simply waiting, she was preparing, just as Alicent was preparing, just as the whole realm was preparing, whether it knew it or not, for the fire that was coming. On Dragonstone, Rhaenyra Targaryen found herself isolated from the court, but not from ambition. The island fortress became a new seat of power, but it lacked one thing: a consort equal to her station. Her marriage to Laenor Velaryon had been a political arrangement, and after his death, the question of who would stand beside her grew urgent. The answer came in the form of her uncle, Prince Daemon Targaryen. Daemon had returned from the Stepstones, a proven warrior and dragon rider, and his bond with Rhaenyra had long simmered beneath the surface of courtly propriety. In the year 120 after the conquest, they were married in a ceremony on Dragonstone, uniting two of the most formidable dragon-riding branches of House Targaryen. Rhaenyra rode Syrax and Daemon rode Caraxes, the Bloodworm. Together, they commanded the loyalty of several other dragons, including the young mounts of Rhaenyra's sons from her first marriage. The union was controversial. Some whispered of ambition, others of love, but it solidified Rhaenyra's position as the undisputed head of the Black faction. From this marriage came two sons. The first, named Aegon after the Conqueror, was born in 120 after the conquest. He was called Aegon the Younger to distinguish him from his uncle, King Aegon II. The second son, Viserys, arrived 2 years later. These boys strengthened the Black line with additional heirs, ensuring that Rhaenyra's claim would not rest solely on the 3 sons she had with Laenor. The presence of these children, born of a true Targaryen union, gave her cause a deeper dynastic legitimacy. While Rhaenyra built her family on Dragonstone, Alicent Hightower worked to secure the future of her own children in King's Landing. The Green faction needed a marriage that would bind their claim together, and the most obvious choice lay within the family itself. Following the ancient Targaryen custom of marrying brother to sister, Alicent arranged for her eldest son, Aegon II, to wed his own sister, Helaena. The ceremony took place in the Red Keep, a grand affair that displayed the wealth and influence of the Greens. Helaena was known for her gentle nature and her fascination with prophecy and insects, but her marriage was purely political. It consolidated the Green claim by producing heirs who were undeniably of the pure Targaryen bloodline. Aegon and Helaena soon had children of their own. Twins, a boy named Jaehaerys and a girl named Jaehaera, and later a younger son, Maelor. These children became the future of the Green dynasty, just as Rhaenyra's sons were the future of the Blacks. The rival dynasties now possessed marriages, dragons, children, castles, and allies of their own. Dragonstone and King's Landing stood as 2 separate courts, each claiming the Iron Throne. The realm began to divide its loyalties, with great houses choosing sides. The stage was set, and as King Viserys' health continued to fail, the 2 factions prepared for what was to come. The king's decline was slow but unmistakable. Viserys I, once a vigorous ruler who had presided over a decade of peace and prosperity, now moved through the Red Keep like a ghost. His flesh was ravaged by a wasting disease that left him bedridden for long stretches, and his mind often wandered to memories of his beloved first wife, Aemma Arryn, and the son he had lost. Yet even in his weakened state, he clung to the throne, refusing to name a definitive successor beyond the public declaration he had made years earlier. His council, dominated by Alicent Hightower and her father, Sir Otto Hightower, whispered of the king's frailty and the need for a strong hand. But Viserys remained stubborn, believing that his daughter Rhaenyra would one day rule. The tension between the 2 factions grew palpable in the halls of the Red Keep. Lords and ladies chose their sides with care, knowing that a single misstep could mean ruin. The Greens held the capital, the treasury, and the king's ear. The Blacks controlled the largest dragons and the loyalty of the North, the Riverlands, and the Vale. Both sides sent ravens to the great houses, seeking oaths of fealty. Lord Corlys Velaryon, the Sea Snake, threw his immense wealth and fleet behind Rhaenyra, his granddaughter's mother. The Lannisters of Casterly Rock, ever pragmatic, sided with the Greens, as did the Baratheons of Storm's End, bound by marriage to the Hightowers. The realm fractured along lines of blood and ambition. In the year 129 after the conquest, King Viserys finally succumbed to his illness. He died in his sleep, his last words a mumble of Aemma's name. The news was kept secret for a time, as Alicent and Otto moved swiftly to secure the throne for Aegon II. They summoned the lords of the small council and presented the king's death as a fait accompli. Aegon, reluctant and dissolute, was crowned in the dragon pit before a crowd of nobles and commoners. The crown of Aegon the Conqueror was placed upon his head, and the septon anointed him with the 7 oils. Rhaenyra, on Dragonstone, received word of her half-brother's usurpation days later. Her fury was cold and absolute. She called her council, mounted Syrax, and flew to the nearby town of Spicetown to rally support. The dance of the dragons had begun. Rhaenyra's marriage to Aemond Targaryen on Dragonstone sent a clear signal across the realm. The heir to the Iron Throne had not only secured a formidable dragon rider as her consort, but she had also joined 2 of the most powerful bloodlines in Westeros. Their sons, Aegon the Younger and Viserys, gave the Black faction a new generation of claimants. On Dragonstone, Rhaenyra built her own court, surrounded by loyalists like Lord Corlys Velaryon and the Sea Snake's fleet. But in King's Landing, the court of King Viserys grew increasingly divided. The king's health had been declining for years. He moved more slowly, spoke more softly, and often seemed lost in memories of his first wife, Aemma Arryn. Those around him noticed that he could no longer hold court for long hours without needing to rest. And as the king faded, the question of who would truly rule in his name became urgent. Otto Hightower had served as Hand of the King for many years, but his relationship with Viserys had grown strained. Otto was a man of careful calculation, always looking ahead to the succession. He saw Rhaenyra's marriage to Daemon as a direct threat to the stability of the realm, and he did not hesitate to voice his concerns. In council meetings, he argued that Rhaenyra's children with Daemon would inevitably press their claim against the children of Queen Alicent. He warned that the realm could not survive a war between 2 dragon-riding families. But Viserys, ever protective of his chosen heir, grew tired of Otto's relentless pressure. The king believed that Rhaenyra was his rightful successor, and he did not want to hear constant doubts about her loyalty or her children's legitimacy. So in the year 111, Viserys made a decision that shocked the court. He dismissed Otto Hightower as Hand of the King. The official reason was that Otto had served long and well, and the king wished to grant him rest. But everyone knew the truth. Otto had pushed too hard against Rhaenyra, and Viserys would not tolerate any challenge to his daughter's position. The dismissal was a public humiliation for House Hightower, and it left Queen Alicent without her father's guiding presence at court. For a time, Alicent stood alone, surrounded by a king who grew more distant and a court that whispered about her ambitions. But the political landscape of King's Landing is never static. Viserys appointed a new hand, a man named Lionel Strong, who was known for his competence and his lack of strong ties to either faction. Lionel Strong served faithfully, but he could not fill the void left by Otto's departure. The king's health continued to decline, and the realm's attention turned to the succession. Rhaenyra remained on Dragonstone, raising her children and waiting. Alicent, meanwhile, watched her own children grow. Aegon was a young man now, with a dragon of his own, but he showed little interest in ruling. Helena was gentle and kind, fond of insects and prophecies. Aemond, still nursing the loss of his eye, trained tirelessly with sword and dragon. Daeron, the youngest, had been sent to Oldtown to serve as a warden squire. Alicent knew that her children's futures depended on the crown, and she could not protect them alone. The turning point came when Lionel Strong died under mysterious circumstances. A fire at Harrenhal claimed the lives of both Lionel and his son Harwin, the man rumoured to be the true father of Rhaenyra's eldest sons. The tragedy removed 2 key figures from the political board. Viserys, now more isolated and frail than ever, needed a hand he could trust, and in his weakened state, he turned back to the one man who had always been reliable, the one man who understood the machinery of government better than anyone. Otto Hightower was recalled to King's Landing and restored as Hand of the King. The moment Otto returned, The balance of power in the Red Keep shifted. He brought with him decades of experience, a network of allies, and a patience that bordered on ruthlessness. He did not waste time on open confrontation. Instead, he quietly filled key positions with men loyal to the Greens. He placed his own agents in the Treasury, the City Watch, and the royal household. He ensured that the small council answered to him, and that the king's orders passed through his hands before reaching the rest of the court. Viserys, too weary to notice or too trusting to care, allowed Otto to manage the day-to-day affairs of the realm. The king spent more and more time in his chambers, attended by maesters and servants, while Otto ruled in his name. For Alicent, her father's return was a profound relief. She had spent years fighting alone, trying to protect her children from a court that saw them as obstacles. Now she had an ally who understood the game better than anyone. Otto did not need to explain his strategies to her. They spoke in half sentences, in glances, in shared silences. He knew that the key to securing Aegon's future was not open rebellion, but patient preparation. They needed to control the succession, to ensure that when Viserys finally died, the crown would pass to Aegon without a struggle. And to do that, they needed to control the capital, the treasury, the army, and the dragons. The king grew weaker with each passing moon. He could barely walk without assistance. His skin grew pale, his breath shallow. He often mistook Alicent for Aemma, or called Aegon by the name of a son who had died in infancy. Those who attended him knew that the end was near, and in the shadows of the Red Keep, Otto Hightower and his daughter prepared for the day when the king's authority would end. They did not speak of it openly. They did not need to. Every appointment, every letter, every quiet meeting in the Tower of the Hand was a step toward that moment. Alicent watched her father work, and she learned. She saw how he turned patience into power, how he let others make mistakes while he waited. She saw how he used the king's love for Rhaenyra against her, by never directly attacking the princess, but instead building a wall of loyalists around the throne. And she saw how he directed all of his experience, all of his patience, all of his ruthlessness toward one goal: securing the future of her children. For Alicent, that was everything. She had given up her friendship with Rhaenyra, her youth, her peace of mind. She had borne 4 children in a marriage that was never truly hers. She had watched her husband waste away while she stood by. But now, with her father at her side, she felt something she had not felt in years. She felt that she was not alone. The court of King's Landing settled into an uneasy calm. Rhaenyra remained on Dragonstone, receiving reports from her own spies. She knew that Otto was back. She knew that the Greens were consolidating power. But she also knew that her father still loved her, and that as long as he lived, she was safe. She did not yet understand how fragile that safety was. The king's health was a thread, and every day it grew thinner. On Dragonstone, Rhaenyra held her children, close and trusted in the bonds of blood. In the Red Keep, Alicent and Otto prepared for the day when those bonds would be tested by fire and steel. With Otto Hightower back as Hand of the King, the Greens held the machinery of government firmly in their grasp. But the king himself was fading. Viserys I had never fully recovered from the years of illness that had eaten away at his body. And by the late 120s, he was a shadow of the man who had once presided over a golden age. His skin was mottled, his left eye socket empty, and he required a mask of solid gold to hide the decay of his face. Yet in his final years, Viserys attempted one last reconciliation between Alicent's family and Rhaenyra's. He summoned both households to the Red Keep for a family supper, hoping that proximity and shared memory might bridge the chasm that had grown between them. Rhaenyra came from Dragonstone with Daemon and their sons. The older boys, Jacaerys and Lucerys, were now young men, trained in arms and dragonback. The younger ones, Aegon the Younger and Viserys, were still children, but already aware of the tension that crackled through every royal gathering. Alicent's children arrived from their own corners of the keep. Aegon the Elder, sullen and drunk. Helaena, quiet and distant. Aemond, sharp-eyed and watchful, with a sapphire gleaming where his left eye had once been. Daeron was still in Oldtown, serving as a squire, so the table was not quite full, but it was the closest the family had come to unity in years. The supper itself was held in a private chamber, not the great hall. Viserys was wheeled in on a chair, his body frail but his mind still capable of moments of clarity. He wore his crown and his gold mask, and he smiled at his children and grandchildren as they took their seats. The king's brief appearance of warmth persuaded both women to offer fragile gestures of peace. Alicent, seated beside her husband, nodded toward Rhaenyra and said something about the children playing together. Rhaenyra, in turn, offered a thin smile and a toast to the health of the family. For a few minutes, the room felt almost normal, but the younger generation quickly revived the old antagonisms, especially between Aemond and Rhaenyra's sons. Aemond, still nursing the wound of his lost eye and the humiliation of being called a liar at Driftmark, could not resist a barbed comment about Lucerys's dragon, Arax, being too small for a real battle. Lucerys flushed red. Jacaerys placed a hand on his brother's arm. Daemon watched from the far end of the table, his expression unreadable. The tension rose like heat from a fire that had never truly been extinguished. Viserys, perhaps sensing the shift, raised his goblet and called for a song. Helena, who had been staring at her plate, began to hum a melancholy tune. The servants brought out a small band of musicians, and the clatter of cups and forced laughter filled the room. The evening ended with music, forced smiles, and the knowledge that Viserys' death would destroy the truce. Alicent and Rhaenyra exchanged a glance that was not quite hatred, not quite sorrow, but something in between, a recognition that they were both mothers, both queens in their own way, and both trapped by the choices of the men around them. As the supper broke up, Rhaenyra and her family departed for Dragonstone the next morning. Alicent watched them go from a window in Maegor's holdfast, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She knew that the king's strength was failing, that the fragile peace of that single meal would not outlast him, and she knew that when he died, the Greens would move. The only question was how quickly the fire would spread. The king's decline accelerated after that night. Within a fortnight, Viserys I could no longer rise from his bed. The maesters attended him day and night, but their arts were useless against the ravages of time and disease. Alicent seldom left his side, and in his fevered mutterings, the king spoke often of the prophecy, of Aegon's dream, of the prince that was promised, of a song of ice and fire. He whispered the name Aegon, and Alicent, hearing only the name of her own son, took it as a sign. She believed Viserys had changed his mind on his deathbed, that he had finally named Aegon the Elder his heir. Whether the king meant his grandson or his own long-dead brother, no one would ever know, but that misunderstanding became the spark that lit the realm ablaze. Viserys died in his sleep on the third day of the third moon of the year 129 after Aegon's conquest. His body was discovered by a servant at dawn. Alicent did not weep. She'd prepared for this moment for years. She summoned Lord Larys Strong, Sir Criston Cole, and her father Otto Hightower to a private council. The small council chambers were cold that morning. The fire had not yet been lit. Otto spoke first, his voice measured and grave. The king is dead. We must act before word reaches Dragonstone. The succession must be secured. Criston Cole, now Lord Commander of the King's Guard, nodded. He had long been a champion of the Greens, his loyalty to Alicent absolute. Larys Strong, the Master of Whisperers, said little but offered the key to the city's gates and the loyalty of the Gold Cloaks. The plan was simple: crown Aegon the Elder before Rhaenyra could claim the throne, and present the realm with a fait accompli. Aegon himself was found in a flea-bottom brothel, drunk and half-dressed. Sir Criston dragged him back to the Red Keep, where his mother and grandfather dressed him in royal robes and placed the Conqueror's crown upon his head. The ceremony was held in the Great Hall before a sparse audience. The lords of the Crownlands who had been summoned in haste, the members of the small council, and a handful of septons. Aegon swayed on his feet, his eyes unfocused. When the crown was set upon his brow, he muttered, "My father never meant this." But no one listened. The High Septon anointed him with oil and proclaimed him Aegon II, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms. The bells of the great sept of Baelor rang out across King's Landing, and the small folk gathered in the streets, uncertain whether to cheer or to flee. Rhaenyra learned of her father's death and her half-brother's usurpation within a day. A raven arrived at Dragonstone, bearing a letter from Queen Alicent, written in her own hand. It was a letter of condolence and command, offering Rhaenyra a place at court if she would bend the knee to Aegon. Rhaenyra read it aloud to Daemon and her council, a voice trembling with rage. Daemon laughed, a cold, hard sound. "She offers you mercy," he said. "We will show her none." Rhaenyra tore the letter in half and threw it into the fire. Then she called for her crown. The crown her father had given her, the crown of the heir. She placed it on her own head and declared herself Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. The Blacks were born in that moment, and the dance of the dragons began in earnest. Across the realm, lords and ladies chose their sides. The great houses split like a cracked shield. The North, the Riverlands, and the Vale declared for Rhaenyra. The Stormlands, the Reach, and the Westerlands rallied to Aegon. The Iron Islands waited, as they always did, to see which side would bleed more, and the dragons stirred in their lairs, sensing the coming storm. The fire that had smouldered for years now roared into an inferno, and no supper, no song, no fragile peace could ever put it out. That last family supper, the fragile gestures of peace exchanged between Alicent and Rhaenyra, they did not hold. Within days, King Viserys I was too weak to leave his bed. The illness that had been consuming him for years had finally reached its end. Alicent stayed by his side, watching over him as she had for so long. But the king's mind wandered. In his fevered state, he spoke of the prophecy of Aegon the Conqueror, the dream of a united realm against a coming darkness. He murmured about the prince that was promised. And Alicent, hearing the name Aegon, believed her husband was speaking of their son. It was a misunderstanding that would shape the course of history. But at that moment, it only deepened her conviction. Then, in the 129th year after Aegon's conquest, King Viserys I died. He passed in silence in the early hours of the morning, with only a few servants and his queen present. The realm did not yet know, and that was exactly how Alicent, her father Otto Hightower, Sir Criston Cole, and the rest of the Green Council intended to keep it. King Viserys I died in 129 AC, leaving behind no peaceful mechanism for transferring power. The succession was disputed. Rhaenyra had been named heir years ago, but the king had never formally revoked that decree, even as he fathered sons with Alicent. The law was ambiguous, and the realm was divided, so the Green Council made a decision. They would keep the king's death secret. Alicent, Otto, Sir Criston Cole, and the other members of the small council locked the doors of the Red Keep. They sealed the gates. They told no one outside their inner circle that the king had passed. Their immediate goal was to secure the capital, control the royal treasury, and prevent Rhaenyra from acting first. They knew that if word reached Dragonstone, Rhaenyra would claim the throne immediately. She had dragons. She had supporters. They had to move before she could. The succession crisis began in locked chambers before the realm even learned that its king was dead. In those quiet rooms, the Greens debated their next steps. Should they offer Rhaenyra terms? Should they crown Aegon at once? Otto argued for speed. Sir Criston Cole argued for strength. Alicent, caught between her father's ambition and her own sense of duty, ultimately sided with those who would see her son on the throne. The body of King Viserys was not prepared for viewing. No announcement was made. The city continued its daily routines, unaware that the crown had already passed into the hands of those who would fight to keep it. The treasury was secured. The gold cloaks, the city watch, were placed under the command of men loyal to the Greens. Ravens were kept from flying. The capital became a cage, and inside that cage, a new king was being prepared. The realm remained ignorant, but the wheels of war were already turning. The next moves would determine the fate of the dynasty, and they would be made in the shadows. For the sun rose onto a kingdom that had lost its king. On the morning after the king's death, the Green Council moved swiftly. They summoned the High Septon to the Red Keep under the guise of a private audience. When he arrived, he found not a dying king, but a living queen and a prince ready to be crowned. Alicent presented her son Aegon, now a man of 20, and demanded the ancient ceremony. The High Septon hesitated, but Otto Hightower's gold and Sir Criston Cole's steel convinced him. The coronation was held in the Dragon Pit, a place of fire and stone, where the people of King's Landing were gathered under threat of the city watch. They were told their king had died, and a new king had been chosen. Aegon II was crowned with the Conqueror's crown, and the crowd cheered, some out of loyalty, most out of fear. The dragons of the Greens, Sunfire, Vagar, and Dreamfire, circled above, their shadows darkening the streets. The realm was presented with a fait accompli. Aegon was king, but the truth could not be hidden forever. Ravens were sent to the great houses, but only those loyal to the Greens received the full message. Others received vague notices of the king's passing, and on Dragonstone, Rhaenyra remained unaware, her own ravens grounded by the blockade. Yet the sea carries whispers. A fisherman's boat, a smuggler's ship, a loyalist lord's messenger, all found ways to slip through. Within a week, the news reached Rhaenyra's ears. She was in the painted table chamber when Daemon brought her the word. The king was dead, and her half-brother had taken the throne. The dance of the dragons had begun. The king's death remained a secret within the walls of the Red Keep. For a few precious hours, only Alicent, Otto, Sir Criston Cole, and a handful of trusted servants knew that Viserys had drawn his final breath. That silence was a weapon, and the Green Council meant to use it before the news could reach Dragonstone. The council chamber was crowded with the architects of the coming war. Otto Hightower sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of calculated calm. Sir Criston Cole stood near the door, armoured and watchful. Grand Maester Orwyle had been summoned, along with Lord Jasper Wild, the Master of Laws, and Lord Lyman Beesbury, the Master of Coin. Beesbury was the only one present who had not been party to the long planning. He was old, loyal to the crown, and deeply uneasy. Otto spoke first. He laid out the situation plainly. King Viserys was dead. The succession had been a matter of public record for nearly 2 decades. Rhaenyra had been named heir, confirmed by oaths from every lord in the realm. But Otto argued that those oaths had been sworn to a king who had changed his mind, or at least whose mind had been clouded by grief and illness. He claimed that Viserys, in his final days, had spoken of Aegon as his successor. Whether that was true or a convenient fiction, Otto did not allow time for debate on that point. The council debated whether to honour Viserys' long-standing designation of Rhaenyra as heir. Lord Beesbury was the most vocal. He reminded everyone that the lords of Westeros had sworn fealty to Rhaenyra, that breaking that oath would be treason, and that the realm would bleed for it. He spoke of honour, of law, of the chaos that would follow a usurpation, but his voice was one against many. Otto countered with cold pragmatism. He argued that Aegon must be crowned before Rhaenyra could gather dragons and supporters. The princess was on Dragonstone, surrounded by her family and their mounts. If she learned of Viserys' death before Aegon sat the Iron Throne, she would rally the Black faction and strike first. Speed was everything. Delay meant war, but a swift coronation might force Rhaenyra to accept a fait accompli. Otto believed that many lords would abandon her cause once they saw Aegon wearing the Conqueror's crown. Alicent sat at the table, her hands folded in her lap. She had spent years preparing for this moment, yet the weight of it pressed down on her. She supported her son's cause, whether from conviction, fear, maternal instinct, or all three at once. She had convinced herself that Viserys had wanted Aegon to rule, that his final mumbled had been a blessing. She believed that Rhaenyra's children were bastards, that the realm would never accept a woman on the throne, and that only Aegon could keep the peace. But beneath that belief was a mother's terror. She had seen what happened to claimants who lost. Rhaenyra would not spare Aegon or his brothers. Alicent's support was not just ambition, it was survival. Sir Criston Cole added his voice to Otto's. He spoke of Rhaenyra's dishonour, of her affair with Daemon, of the rumours that her sons were not trueborn. He painted her as unfit to rule, a woman who would bring chaos and corruption to the throne. The Kingsguard's loyalty had long since shifted to the Greens, and his words carried weight. Lord Wild agreed. Lord Beesbury continued to protest, but his arguments were drowned out. The decision was made. The Green Council would not honour Viserys's designation. They would crown Aegon II, and they would do it immediately. That decision transformed years of court intrigue into an act of open usurpation. What had been whispers, alliances, and quiet preparations now became a public declaration of war. The realm would soon know that the king was dead, and that a new king had been chosen not by law, but by the counsel of a few men and one queen. The first steps were taken that very night. Messengers were dispatched to the Gold Cloaks, to the lords of the Crownlands who could be trusted, to the commanders of the City Watch. The Red Keep was sealed. No raven would leave without the hand's approval. And in the depths of the castle, Aegon was roused from his chambers, confused and reluctant to be told that he was now king. Alicent watched her son's face as the crown was placed upon his head in a private ceremony. She saw fear there, and perhaps a flicker of pride. She told herself that this was right, that she had done what was necessary, but the silence of the council chamber echoed in her mind, and she knew that the war had already begun. The next morning, the bells of the Great Sept would ring out across King's Landing. The small folk would gather, wondering why the city was so quiet, why the gates were closed. And then the announcement would come. King Viserys was dead. Long live King Aegon II. The Green Council had made its choice, and the Dance of the Dragons was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. The Green Council had made its decision. Aegon must be crowned, and quickly, before Rhaenyra could gather her dragons and her allies. But there was one problem that no amount of plotting around a council table could solve. Aegon II was not waiting eagerly for a crown, and no one in that room knew exactly where to find him. So the search began. Green agents, knights of the Kingsguard, and trusted household men fanned out across King's Landing in the hours after Viserys I drew his last breath. They moved through the winding streets of the city, through the markets and the taverns and the brothels, places a prince might go when he wanted to escape the weight of expectations. The search for Aegon became a quiet, urgent race through the capital, a hunt conducted in shadows while the rest of the realm still believed the old king lived. And what the searchers found, as they tracked the prince from one disreputable establishment to another, was a young man utterly unprepared for what his family intended to place upon him. Aegon was not studying statecraft, or practicing with a sword, or preparing himself for the burden of rule. He was drinking. He was carousing. He was losing himself in the pleasures of the city, trying to forget that he was the firstborn son of a king, and that his mother and grandfather had spent years building a faction around his name. The search reveals a prince who had never been asked what he wanted. From childhood, Aegon had been told that he was the rightful heir, that Rhaenyra's claim was an insult to tradition and to the laws of the realm. But no one had ever asked him if he wished to be king. And now, as the Green Council moved forward with its plans, Aegon was nowhere to be found, hiding from the very destiny his family had constructed for him. Alicent, waiting in the Red Keep, felt the gap between the son she loved and the king she needed him to become. She had raised Aegon with the understanding that he would one day sit the Iron Throne. She had protected him, guided him, shaped his education and his alliances, but she had also watched him retreat further and further from responsibility, seeking comfort in wine and women, and the company of friends who encouraged his worst impulses. The boy she remembered The child who had once looked to her for reassurance had grown into a man who seemed determined to avoid the very crown she had spent years securing for him. The hours stretched on. Messengers returned with nothing. The prince had been seen in one part of the city, then another, always a step ahead of those who sought him. Sir Criston Cole, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, took charge of the search himself, moving through the streets with a grim determination. He knew what was at stake. Every moment Aegon remained hidden, as Rhaenyra might learn of her father's death and begin to act. By the time Aegon was found, the machinery of coronation was already in motion. The searchers finally located him in a flea-bottom hovel, drunk and dishevelled, surrounded by the detritus of a night spent trying to forget his own name. Sir Criston and the other knights who found him did not give him a choice. They told him that his father was dead, that the small council had declared him king, and that he must come with them at once. Aegon did not argue. Perhaps he was too drunk to resist. Perhaps he had always known this moment would come. But as they led him through the dark streets of King's Landing, he must have understood that his life would never again be his own. The crown was coming, whether he wanted it or not. And in the Red Keep, the preparations continued. The High Septon was summoned. The crown was brought from the vaults. The Great Hall was readied for a coronation that would take place before dawn, before the realm could wake to the news that Viserys was dead and that a new king had already been crowned. The Greens were moving with a speed born of desperation, knowing that their window of opportunity was narrow and that every moment of delay favoured their enemies. Alicent watched it all unfold from her chambers, her hands steady even as her heart raced. She had done what she believed was right. She had protected her son's claim, secured his throne, ensured that the line of succession would follow the traditions of the realm. But as she looked at the crown that would soon rest on Aegon's head, she could not escape the knowledge that she had also set in motion a war that would tear her family apart. The coronation would proceed. The realm would learn that Aegon II was king, and Rhaenyra, far away on Dragonstone, would learn that her father was dead, and that her half-brother had taken the throne she had been promised since childhood. The dance of the dragons was no longer a possibility, it was a certainty, and it would begin with the crowning of a reluctant prince in the darkness before dawn. They found him in a flea-bottom hovel, drunk and hiding from the crown his family insisted he wear. Aegon II had spent his last hours of freedom clutching a cup of Arbor gold, trying to forget that his father's death meant the realm would tear itself apart over him. But the Green Council had no intention of letting him slip away. Sir Criston Cole and Lord Larys Strong dragged the prince back to the Red Keep, cleaned him up, and dressed him in the black and red of a Targaryen king. There would be no more running. By dawn, the Dragon Pit was prepared. The vast domed arena, built by Maegor the Cruel to house the royal dragons, had been transformed into a coronation hall. Thousands of small folk packed the stands, their murmurs echoing off the stone walls. They had been summoned by criers in the night, told that the king was dead and that a new king would be crowned at first light. Most came out of curiosity, some out of loyalty, and many simply because they had nowhere else to go. The air smelled of incense and sweat, and the faint sulphur of dragon stables below. Aegon was led through a side passage, his steps unsteady. He had not slept, and the wine still clung to his breath. Alicent walked beside him, her hand firm on his arm, her face a mask of composure. She had spent the night in the council chamber, finalising every detail with Otto and the others. The crown must be placed before any raven could reach Dragonstone. Speed was everything. If Rhaenyra learned of Viserys' death before the coronation, she might fly to King's Landing with Syrax and claim the throne by dragonfire. The Greens could not risk that, so the ceremony began before the sun had fully risen over Blackwater Bay. The High Septon himself performed the anointing, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. He poured the 7 oils over Aegon's brow, his chest, his hands, reciting the ancient prayers of the faith. Aegon knelt on the marble floor, his eyes fixed on the ground. He did not look at his mother. He did not look at the thousands of faces watching him. He looked only at the stone beneath his knees, as if hoping it might swallow him. Then came the crown. Sir Criston Cole stepped forward, bearing the circlet of Aegon the Conqueror. It was a simple band of Valyrian steel, set with rubies the size of a child's thumb, the same crown that had sat on the head of the first Targaryen king when he united the Seven Kingdoms. Sir Criston held it high for the crowd to see, then placed it gently on Aegon's head. The rubies caught the torchlight and glowed like embers. Sir Criston drew his sword and raised it in a salute. He was not a lord, not a prince, but a knight of the Kingsguard, and his voice carried the weight of a warrior's authority. He declared Aegon the second king of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, protector of the realm. The crowd erupted in cheers, though many had come only to see a spectacle. The sound of their voices filled the dragon pit, bouncing off the high arches until it became a single roar. Aegon stood, the crown heavy on his brow, and for a moment he looked like a king. Alicent watched from the dais, her hands clasped in front of her. She was now Queen Mother, the guardian of the Green Dynasty. Her son wore the Conqueror's crown. Her father stood at the head of the small council. Her faction controlled the capital, the treasury, and the largest dragon in the realm. She had done what she believed was necessary to protect her children and her house. But as she looked at Aegon's face, she saw not triumph but fear. He was not his father. He was not his grandfather. He was a young man who had never wanted this, and now he carried a kingdom on his shoulders. The coronation feast was held that evening in the Red Keep, but the celebrations were muted. The Green Council knew that the real battle had only just begun. Rhaenyra would not accept this quietly. She had been named heir for nearly 20 years. She had the support of the North, the Riverlands, the Vale, and the Iron Islands. She had dragons of her own, and she had a claim that many still considered legitimate. Across the narrow sea, on the island of Dragonstone, Rhaenyra learned the news before the sun set. A raven from King's Landing arrived with a single scroll, sealed with the golden hand of the king. The message was brief. King Viserys was dead. Aegon had been crowned. Rhaenyra read the words twice, then let the parchment fall to the floor. She stood in the Stone Drum, the ancient fortress of her ancestors, and looked out the window at the distant smudge of land that was King's Landing. Her father was gone. Her throne had been stolen, and the war she had dreaded for years was now inevitable. She turned to her husband, Daemon, who stood by the hearth with Dark Sister at his hip. His eyes were cold, calculating. He had been waiting for this moment. Rhaenyra spoke only one word, but it carried the weight of a kingdom. War. I hope you're as amazed by this as I am. If you want to stay updated on more content like this, make sure to subscribe and join our community of curious minds. Trust me, what's coming next will challenge everything you thought you knew. The news of Aegon's coronation reached Dragonstone within days, carried by ravens and whispered by sailors who had witnessed the golden dragon flying above the dragon pit. Rhaenyra Targaryen, the named heir of Viserys I, had been waiting for this moment, dreading it and preparing for it in equal measure. She was 7 months pregnant with her 6th child, but she did not let that slow her. On Dragonstone, surrounded by her husband Prince Daemon, her sons Jaehaerys and Lucerys, and her most trusted advisors, she called a council of her own. There was no debate about whether to accept the usurpation. The question was how to respond. On the same day that Aegon II sat the Iron Throne in King's Landing, Rhaenyra Targaryen was crowned Queen of the Seven Kingdoms on Dragonstone. The ceremony was smaller, more intimate, but no less solemn. She wore a gown of black and red, the colours of House Targaryen, and upon her head was placed the crown of her father, the same crown Viserys had worn for nearly 3 decades. Her supporters knelt and swore their oaths. The black dragon of her house flew above the ancient fortress, and Syrax, her own dragon, let out a roar that echoed across the narrow sea. 2 monarchs now claimed the Iron Throne. Two courts formed in opposition. In King's Landing, the Greens held the capital, the treasury, and the Great Sept. On Dragonstone, the Blacks held the ancestral seat of the Targaryen dynasty, the largest collection of dragons, and the loyalty of several powerful houses in the north, the Riverlands, and the Vale. Alicent Hightower, once Rhaenyra's closest friend, was now formally her enemy. Each woman believed she was defending the true order of the realm. Alicent saw her son as the rightful king by tradition and by the will of the lords who had sworn to uphold the male line. Rhaenyra saw herself as the chosen heir of Viserys, the one he had named before the realm time and again. There was no middle ground. Envoys began to move between castles, carrying letters and demands. The Green Council sent terms to Dragonstone. If Rhaenyra would bend the knee and swear fealty to Aegon, she would be allowed to keep Dragonstone as her seat, and her son Jacaerys would be named heir to the throne after Aegon's own children. It was a generous offer on paper, but it required Rhaenyra to surrender everything she had been promised her entire life. She refused without hesitation. In return, she sent her own envoys to the great houses of the realm, calling on them to honour the oaths they had sworn to her father. Lord Corlys Velaryon, the Sea Snake, threw his support behind the Black Queen, the Starks of Winterfell, the Arryns of the Eyrie, and the Tullys of Riverrun, all declared for Rhaenyra. In the Reach, the Hightowers and their allies stood with Aegon. The realm began to divide. Armies gathered. In the Riverlands, knights and levies mustered under the banner of the Black Dragon. In the Crownlands, lords loyal to the Greens fortified their castles, and everywhere dragons were counted. Rhaenyra had more dragons than Aegon, but many of them were young or riderless. The Greens had fewer, but their dragons were larger and battle-tested. Vargar, the oldest and largest dragon in the world, belonged to Aemond Targaryen. Sunfire, a golden dragon of great beauty and ferocity, belonged to Aegon himself. On Dragonstone, Syrax, Caraxes and Melis were the most formidable, but the young dragons of Rhaenyra's sons were untested in war. For a brief moment, peace remained possible. Both sides sent ravens back and forth, proposing compromises that neither could accept. The Greens offered a great council, a vote of the lords to decide the succession. Rhaenyra countered that the lords had already decided when they swore to her. Every proposed settlement asked one side to surrender its future. The Greens would not give up the crown they had just taken. The Blacks would not abandon the claim they had held for 20 years. The negotiations dragged on through the autumn of 129, but the outcome was already written in the movements of armies and the count of dragons. The realm now had 2 queens, 2 kings, and the dragons were stirring. The first blood would be drawn, not in a great battle, but in a betrayal that shattered any hope of negotiation. The first blood of the dance was drawn not on a battlefield, but in the sky above a storm-tossed bay. Within days of Rhaenyra's coronation on Dragonstone, both queens understood that words would not decide the succession. They needed allies, and they needed them fast. The great houses of Westeros had not yet declared. Some wavered. Others waited to see which side could offer the most convincing show of strength. Rhaenyra, still grieving her father and still furious at the theft of her throne, sent her sons out as envoys. Prince Jacaerys flew north on Vermax to treat with the Starks and the Arryns. Prince Lucerys, her second son, took his young dragon Arax and set out for Storm's End, hoping to secure the allegiance of Lord Boros Baratheon. Storm's End was a fortress built to withstand the fury of the sea and the sky. Its massive drum tower had stood for centuries, a monument to the stubborn pride of the Storm Kings. Lucerys arrived on a day when the winds were already rising, the clouds gathering into a bruise-coloured mass over Shipbreaker Bay. He was only 14 years old. He carried his mother's message, her plea, her offer of an alliance sealed with the betrothal of his younger brother Joffrey to one of Lord Boros's daughters. It was a reasonable offer, but Lucerys did not know that he was not the only dragon rider who had come to Storm's End that day. When he landed in the courtyard, he saw Vargar, the oldest and largest living dragon in the world. The mount of his uncle Aemond Targaryen was resting in the yard like a green mountain. Lucerys understood immediately that he had walked into a trap. Aemond had arrived before him, and he had already made his own offer to Lord Boros. The terms were simple. The Greens promised a marriage pact of their own, and the implicit threat of Vargar's fire. Lord Boros Baratheon was not a subtle man. He received Lucerys in the Great Hall, surrounded by his knights and his daughters. The prince delivered his mother's message, but Boros waved it aside. He asked Lucerys which of his daughters he would choose to marry. If the pact were to be honoured, Lucerys, honest and young, admitted that he had no authority to make such a choice. He was only a messenger. That was enough for Boros. He told Lucerys that his mother's offer was worthless, that he had already pledged his swords to King Aegon, and then he turned the prince over to the mercy of his nephew. Aemond stepped forward. He was tall, one-eyed, and filled with a cold fury that had been burning since the night he lost his eye as a boy. He demanded that Lucerys give up one of his own eyes as payment for the one Aemond had lost years ago. Lucerys refused. Lord Boros, perhaps sensing that he did not want a murder in his own hall, ordered the two princes to take their quarrel outside. He would not allow bloodshed under his roof, but he did nothing to stop what followed. Lucerys fled. He ran to the courtyard, mounted Arax, and launched into the stormy sky. He must have hoped that the darkness and the rain would hide him, that he could outfly his uncle and reach the safety of Dragonstone. But Aemond was not going to let him escape. He climbed onto Vargar, and the old dragon rose into the gale with a roar that shook the stones of Storm's End. The chase was short and terrible. Arax was young, barely large enough to carry a rider. Vargar was a beast from the Age of Conquest, a dragon that had known war and fire for more than a century. The storm lashed them both. Lightning split the clouds, and rain fell in sheets. Lucerys tried to climb higher, to lose his pursuer in the blackness, but Vargar was faster, stronger, and Aemond was determined. Accounts differ on what exactly happened next. Some say Aemond meant only to frighten his nephew, to humiliate him, to force him to yield. Others say the murder was deliberate from the start. What is certain is that Vargar caught Arax from above. The older dragon's jaws closed around the younger one's neck. Arax screamed, a sound that was swallowed by the thunder. Lucerys, clinging to the saddle, had no time to react. Vhagar bit down, and both dragon and rider were torn apart in midair. Their bodies fell into the churning waters of Shipbreaker Bay, lost to the waves. Aemond returned to Storm's End alone. He did not speak of what he had done, but the news travelled faster than any raven. By morning, the realm knew that Prince Lucerys Velaryon was dead, killed by his own uncle on the first real mission of the war. The death of Lucerys ended any serious chance of reconciliation between the rival branches. Until that moment, there had been whispers of negotiation, of a great council, of some compromise that might avoid open war. Those whispers died in the storm. Rhaenyra had lost a son. She would never forgive, never forget. The Greens had drawn first blood, and they had drawn it from the heart of the Black Queen's family. Alicent's family had gained an early advantage. Aemond had removed one of Rhaenyra's dragon riders, and the Greens now held the momentum. But the war had become personal beyond repair. It was no longer a dispute over succession, no longer a question of law or tradition. It was a blood feud. And in the days that followed, both sides would begin to arm themselves, not for a negotiation, but for annihilation. The small council on Dragonstone met in grief and fury. Rhaenyra, when she heard the news, did not weep in public. She sat in silence, her face like stone, and then she gave the order that would set the realm ablaze. Her husband Daemon, ever eager for war, began to plan the first strike. The Blacks would not wait for the Greens to come to them. They would carry the fire to King's Landing. And in the Red Keep, Alicent heard the news from her son. Aemond returned to court, and she saw in his face a mixture of triumph and something else. Something that looked almost like doubt. She did not ask him for details. She did not want to know. But she understood that the war she had helped to start was no longer a game of thrones. It was a war of mothers and sons, and it had only just begun. The death of Lucerys Velaryon was not just a loss for Rhaenyra's cause, it was a wound that demanded an answer in kind, and Daemon Targaryen, the rogue prince, the king consort on Dragonstone, was not a man to let such a wound fester without repayment. He had lost a stepson, a boy he had helped raise, a prince of the realm who had been murdered by his own nephew in the storm above Shipbreaker Bay. For Daemon, the response could not be a formal declaration of war or a measured diplomatic protest. It had to be something that would strike at the very heart of the Green Court, something that would make Aegon II and his mother, Alicent Hightower, feel the same terror they had unleashed. And so, Daemon turned to the shadows of King's Landing. He reached out to men who moved through the city's underbelly, men who knew the secret passages of the Red Keep better than any knight of the Kingsguard. One of them was a former city watchman named Blood, a man of brutal reputation and little conscience. The other was a rat catcher known as Cheese, a man who knew every tunnel and hidden door beneath the castle. Their mission was simple in its horror. Enter the Red Keep, find the chambers of Queen Helaena and her children, and take the life of one of Aegon's sons. An eye for an eye, a son for a son. The night chosen was dark, the castle quiet. The guards were complacent, believing themselves safe within the walls that had held the Iron Throne for generations. But Blood and Cheese moved unseen, following Cheese's knowledge of the servant passages and forgotten stairways. They reached the royal apartments without raising an alarm. Inside, they found Helaena, the queen, and her two young children, the twins Jaehaerys and Jaehaera. Along with their younger brother Maelor, the assassins forced their way into the bedchamber, blades drawn, and seized control of the room. Helaena, a gentle soul who had never sought power or conflict, was forced to watch as the men demanded to know which boy was the eldest son, the heir to the Green Throne. She tried to protect her children, offering them a false answer, but the assassins were not fooled. They knew the prince by his golden hair, by the fine clothes he wore even in sleep. They took Jaehaerys, a boy of 6 years, and in front of his mother and his sister, they ended his life. The queen's screams echoed through the corridors. But by the time the guards arrived, Blood and Cheese had vanished back into the tunnels, leaving behind a chamber drenched in blood and a family shattered beyond repair. Alicent Hightower, who had spent years building a court of order and legitimacy, who had believed the Red Keep was her fortress, her domain, now found that fortress breached by terror from within. The murder of her grandson, the young prince Jaehaerys, took place in the very heart of the castle she thought she controlled. There was no army outside the gates, no dragon attack from the sky. It was a knife in the dark, a message that no one was safe, not even the king's own blood in the king's own bed. The household of the Greens was plunged into grief and paranoia. Every shadow seemed to hide an enemy. Every servant could be a spy. The war had come home, and it had taken the most innocent of them all. From that moment, the Dance of the Dragons ceased to be a contest of claims, a legal dispute over succession fought with dragons and armies. It became something far darker. It became a cycle of grief demanding revenge. The Blacks had lost Lucerys. The Greens had lost Jaehaerys. Each death called for another, and the scales of vengeance would tip back and forth until the realm itself was drained of blood. Alicent, who had once believed she was protecting her family by placing Aegon on the throne, now saw that protection was an illusion. The throne had become a pyre, and her children were the kindling. The news of Jaehaerys' murder spread across the 7 kingdoms, hardening hearts on both sides. Rhaenyra, upon hearing what Daemon had done, was said to be horrified, but she did not punish him. The war had its own momentum now, and no single hand could stop it. The Greens called for retribution, the Blacks prepared for more attacks, and in the Red Keep, Alicent Hightower sat in the ruins of her family, her daughter-in-law Helaena lost, in a grief that would never fully lift. Her son Aegon, the second burning, with a rage that would consume everything he touched. The dance had become a war of atrocity, and the worst was yet to come. The murder of Prince Jaehaerys sent a shockwave through the Red Keep that no amount of ceremony could mask. Aelena, already fragile, retreated further into a world of whispered prophecies and half-finished sentences. Aegon, by contrast, burned with a cold, furious rage. He wanted blood in return, and he wanted it immediately. But his grandfather, Otto Hightower, had a different kind of war in mind. Otto attempted to fight through alliances, gold diplomacy, and careful strategy rather than reckless dragonfire. He had spent decades building networks across the Seven Kingdoms, and he believed that the Green cause could win without turning every conflict into a dragon battle. Letters were dispatched to the Reach, to the Stormlands, to the Riverlands, offering terms, demanding fealty, reminding lords of oaths sworn to Aegon the Elder. Gold flowed from the treasury to secure mercenaries and to bribe wavering houses. Otto's plan was slow, methodical, and designed to starve Rhaenyra's support, without ever committing the royal dragons to a decisive, risky engagement. Aegon, however, had no patience for ink and coin. He had seen his son's headless body displayed before the court. He had heard Helena's screams echo through the stone corridors. Every day that passed without vengeance felt like a betrayal of his crown and his blood. He demanded more direct action, impatient with caution and increasingly hostile toward his grandfather. In council meetings, he interrupted Otto's careful reports with shouts for fire and sword. He wanted to mount Sunfire and burn Dragonstone to ash. He wanted Rhaenyra's children to suffer as his had suffered. The king's fury was a weapon Otto could not control, and it threatened to shatter the very strategy he had built. Alicent found herself caught in the middle, forced to navigate the widening divide between Otto's statecraft and Aegon's need for vengeance. She understood her father's logic. War was a game of patience, and the Greens held the capital, the treasury, and the largest dragon. But she also understood her son. Aegon had never wanted the crown, but now that he wore it, he felt its weight as a personal wound. Alicent tried to calm him, to remind him that Otto served the realm, that rash action could undo everything they had fought for, but her words carried less weight each time. Aegon saw her as part of the old order, the same cautious court that had kept him hidden and powerless for years. The Green cause began to consume the family it was meant to protect. Where once there had been a united front, Otto as Hand, Alicent as Queen Mother, Aegon as King, now there were fractures. Aemond, still brooding over his role in Lucerys's death, watched the tension with cold satisfaction. He had always believed that strength spoke louder than diplomacy. Helaena withdrew entirely, her grief a silent accusation that no one could answer. The small council became a stage for shouting matches, with Otto pleading for restraint and Aegon demanding immediate war. Alicent tried to mediate, but each attempt only deepened the rift. In the end, it was not Otto's strategy that prevailed, but Aegon's rage. The king ordered a strike against Rhaenyra's forces. Not a full invasion, but a demonstration of power. Aegon would fly Sunfire to the castle of a black-aligned lord and burn it to the ground. Otto argued that such an act would turn neutral houses against them, that it would confirm every accusation of tyranny. Aegon dismissed him. The crown, he said, did not beg for loyalty, it demanded it. Alicent watched her son mount his dragon and soar into the sky, and she felt the last thread of her influence slip away. The family she had built, the cause she had championed, was now a machine of vengeance. And vengeance, once unleashed, does not stop at the enemy. It turns inward, consuming everything in its path. The Greens had won the throne, but they were losing the war within themselves. And beyond the walls of King's Landing, on Dragonstone, Rhaenyra was preparing her own answer. One that would not be written with ink or gold, but with fire and blood. The war had not yet seen a true dragon battle. The Greens had moved carefully, using golden words, and the threat of Vargar to bend lords to their cause. But Aegon II, young king crowned in haste and hungry for glory, grew tired of his grandfather's cautious games. He wanted to prove himself. He wanted to burn something, and he wanted to do it without waiting for permission. So when word came that Rhaenys Targaryen, the queen who never was, had taken her dragon Meleys to the small castle of Rook's Rest, Aegon saw his chance. Rook's Rest was a minor holding on the coast of the Crown Lands, loyal to Rhaenyra. Its lord had declared for the Black Queen, and that defiance could not stand. But more than that, Rhaenys herself was there. She was the oldest living dragon rider on the black side, a woman who had been passed over for the throne decades ago, and who now flew the swift and deadly Meleys. If the Greens could kill her, they would strike a terrible blow against Rhaenyra's cause. Aegon decided to lead the attack himself. He mounted Sunfire, his golden dragon, and flew east from King's Landing. He did not tell his council. He did not consult Otto Hightower. He simply went because he was the king, and he believed that a king should lead from the front. But he was not alone. Aemond followed on Vargar, the largest dragon in the world, lurking in the clouds like a shadow of death. At Rook's Rest, the Greens send Aegon and Aemond into battle against Rhaenys Targaryen and Meleys. It was meant to be a trap. Aemond would wait, hidden above the clouds, while Aegon drew Rhaenys out. Then they would strike together. 2 dragons against 1. It was a simple plan, and it might have worked if everything had gone as expected. But war never follows the plan. Rhaenys saw Sunfire approaching and rose to meet him. Meleys was faster than Sunfire, more experienced, and Rhaenys was a veteran of the Stepstones, a woman who had spent years flying in battle. She did not hesitate. She drove Meleys straight at the young king, and the 2 dragons collided in a storm of fire and claws. For a moment, it seemed Aegon might actually win. Sunfire was younger, stronger in raw power, and he bit deep into Meleys' neck. But Meleys was quicker, and she raked Sunfire's belly with her talons, tearing open wounds that bled golden dragon blood into the air. Then Aemond descended. Vhagar came down like a mountain falling. She was 3 times the size of Meleys, 5 times the size of Sunfire. She hit Meleys from above, jaws closing around the red dragon's throat, and the 3 beasts became a tangle of wings and fire and screaming. The clash destroys dragons and leaves Aegon terribly burned and crippled. Sunfire, already wounded, fell from the sky with Aegon still strapped to his saddle. The golden dragon crashed into the ground, breaking his spine, and the king was thrown clear, but not clear enough. His armor melted into his flesh, his bones shattered, his skin cooked black in the heat of his own dragon's dying breath. Rhaenys died in that fall. Meleys was torn apart by Vargar's jaws, and the queen who never was perished with her dragon. A warrior's end for a woman who had spent her whole life being denied what she deserved. But the Green King survived in pain, unable to rule as he once imagined. He lay in the wreckage of Rook's Rest, a broken thing, barely breathing, his body ruined beyond repair. His face was gone. His hands were claws of fused bone and melted steel. He would never walk again without agony. He would never sit the Iron Throne as a whole man. Aemond landed Vargar in the field of death and walked among the corpses. He found his brother lying in a pool of blood and ash. He did not weep. He did not kneel. He simply stood there, looking down at what he had done. And then he flew back to King's Landing to report that the king had fallen in battle. When the news reached the Red Keep, Alicent Hightower's world collapsed for the second time. First, she had lost her father, dismissed from the hand's position by Aegon's own impatience. Now she had lost her son, not to death, but to something worse. She became mother, nurse, political guardian, and witness to the physical ruin of her son. She sat beside his bed for days, weeks, applying salves to wounds that would never heal, listening to him scream in his fever dreams, watching him drift in and out of a pain so deep it seemed to swallow his soul. She had wanted him to be king. She had fought for his crown, schemed for his throne, sacrificed her friendship with Rhaenyra for his birthright, and now she had a king who could not rule, a son who could not speak without weeping, a body that was more scar than skin. She became the power behind the throne in a way she had never imagined. She gave orders in his name. She received lords and maesters. She made decisions about war and peace, while Aegon lay in a drugged haze, unable to even lift his head. But she also became something else. She became a witness. Every day she saw what ambition had done to her family. Every night she heard the echoes of Jaehaerys's death, of Lucerys' fall, of the screams that now came from her own son's chamber. She had believed she was doing the right thing, protecting her children, securing their future. But the future she had built was a room full of broken bodies and empty thrones. And the war was far from over. Rhaenyra still sat on Dragonstone. Daemon still rode Caraxes. The Blacks still had dragons of their own. And they would not stop now. Not after Rook's rest. Not after the death of Rhaenys. The Greens had won a battle, but they had lost their king's strength. And the cost of that victory would be measured in the months of pain and political chaos that followed. Alicent sat alone in the quiet of the night, her hands stained with ointment and blood, and she looked at the ruin of her son's face. She did not pray. She did not cry. She simply watched him breathe, each breath a reminder that survival was not the same as living. And she knew, with a certainty that settled into her bones like cold water, that the worst was still ahead. The silence in the Red Keep after Rook's rest was unlike anything that had come before. It was not the quiet of peace, but the hush of a court holding its breath. King Aegon II lay in the royal apartments, his body wrapped in silken bandages, soaked in milk of the poppy and honey. The masters came and went with grim faces, their hands stained with salves and their words measured. The king would live, they said, but he would never be the same. His skin had melted across half his body. His voice, when it came at all, was a rasping whisper. The dragon Sunfire, too, had been grievously wounded, and now lay in the dragon pit, hurled around his own burns, refusing food. And so, with the king unable to speak, unable to sit the throne, unable even to lift his own hand, the regency passed to another. Aemond Targaryen, the one-eyed prince, the rider of Vargar, stepped into the power his brother could no longer hold. He was named Prince Regent and Protector of the Realm, and he did not wait for the title to settle before he began to use it. Alicent watched this transition from the shadows of the corridor outside Aegon's chamber. She had seen one son carried back to the city, broken and barely alive, his dragon half dead beside him. And now she watched another son stride into the small council chamber with the confidence of a man who had already decided the war was his to win. Aemond did not ask for counsel. He did not seek his mother's approval. He simply took command, and the lords of the Green Council bent to him, because Vargar's shadow fell long over the table. The difference between Aemond and Aegon was stark, and it was dangerous. Aegon had been cruel in his pleasures, lazy in his duties, and reckless in his youth, but he had also been, in some strange way, containable. Otto Hightower had managed him. Alicent had guided him. Even in his worst moments, there had been a leash. Aemond wore no leash. He had spent his childhood in the shadow of his older brother, mocked for not having a dragon, then forged himself into something harder. After claiming the largest beast in the world, he had studied war the way other boys studied history. He had trained with the sword until his hands bled, and now at last the realm was his to command. His first acts as regent were swift and brutal. He sent ravens to every green-held castle, demanding levies and supplies. He ordered the gold cloaks to double their patrols in the city, and any man heard speaking of Rhaenyra as queen was to be arrested and tried for treason. He summoned the lords who had been slow to answer the call to war, and reminded them, in terms that left no room for misunderstanding, that Vargar could reduce any keep in the realm to ash in a single afternoon. But it was his treatment of the small council that revealed the true shape of his rule. Otto Hightower, the hand of the king, had spent decades navigating the treacherous currents of court politics. He had outmaneuvered rivals, secured alliances, and built the Green faction from the ground up. He was a man of patience and calculation, and he believed that the war could still be won through strategy, through the careful application of gold and diplomacy, rather than through the indiscriminate use of dragonfire. Aemond had no patience for any of it. He dismissed Otto's counsel with a wave of his hand. He overruled his grandfather in open council, and he made it clear that the war would now be fought on his terms. Alicent saw the fracture forming and could not stop it. She had spent her life trying to hold the family together, to keep the Greens unified, to preserve the promise of stability that had once seemed so certain. But that promise had been shattered at Rook's Rest, and what remained was fear and rivalry, and the escalating violence of a war that no one could control. She watched her father leave the small council chamber, with his jaw tight and his eyes cold, and she knew that the alliance between the Hand and the Prince Regent was already crumbling. Aemond's boldness brought military force to the Green cause. He rode Vagar over the Riverlands, and the smoke of burning villages rose behind him. He sent word to the lords, who had declared for Rhaenyra, that they would face his dragon if they did not bend the knee, and for a time it worked. Men surrendered rather than burn. Castles opened their gates. The Greens advanced on multiple fronts, and the Blacks struggled to respond. But cruelty and impatience were woven into every victory. Aemond did not accept surrender gracefully. He demanded total submission, and he punished those who had resisted even briefly with fire and steel. He burned villages that had already pledged neutrality. He executed prisoners who might have been ransomed or exchanged. He treated the war not as a political conflict to be resolved, but as a personal vendetta to be satisfied. And beneath all of it, there was the memory of Lucerys Velaryon. Aemond had killed the boy above Shipbreaker Bay, and that death had brought blood and cheese into the Red Keep. It had taken Jaehaerys, Helena's son, and it had broken something in the royal family that could never be mended. Aemond carried that guilt, though he would never admit it. He wore it as a second scar, invisible but constant, and it drove him to prove, again and again, that he was not afraid, that he would not hesitate, that he was the weapon the Greens needed to win. Alicent watched her son become something she did not recognise. She had raised him in the faith of the Seven, had taught him to read and pray and speak with the measured courtesy expected of a prince. She had seen him lose his eye as a child, had held him while he screamed, had watched him grow into a young man of sharp intelligence and simmering anger. But she had not foreseen this. She had not imagined that the boy who once studied histories of the conquest would become a regent who burned through the Riverlands like a wildfire, leaving nothing but ash and grief. The family's original promise of stability had been built on the idea that the Greens could rule wisely, that Aegon's coronation would bring order to a realm divided by Viserys' indecision. But that promise had rotted from within. Aegon lay broken in his bed. Helaena had retreated into a silence that no one could reach, her eyes hollow and her hands trembling whenever she heard a child's voice. Daeron was still in Oldtown, young and untested, a distant hope rather than a present comfort. And Aemond, the son who should have been the family's shield, had become its sword, and swords do not know when to stop. The Red Keep grew colder as the war stretched on. Alicent spent her days moving between Aegon's sick room and the Sept, praying to the Mother for mercy she no longer believed would come. She saw the way the courtiers looked at her now, not with the deference they had once shown the Queen Dowager, but with a wary distance, as if she were a relic of a world that had already ended. The power she had once held, the influence she had cultivated through years of careful manoeuvring, had passed to Aemond, and he wielded it without her guidance, without her restraint. There were moments, late at night, when she stood at the window of her chambers and looked out over the city. The lights of King's Landing flickered below, and somewhere beyond the walls, the war continued. Rhaenyra was still on Dragonstone, still gathering her forces, still waiting for the moment to strike. And Alicent, who had once called Rhaenyra her closest friend, who had once believed that they could find a way to avoid this destruction, now knew that there was no going back. The war had taken everything. It had taken Jaehaerys. It had taken Aegon's health. It had taken Aemond's humanity. And it would not stop until one side was utterly destroyed. The Greens had won battles, but they were losing the war in ways that could not be measured in castles or armies. They were losing the trust of the small folk, who watched their villages burn, and their sons die for a crown that meant nothing to them. They were losing the loyalty of their own lords, who saw Aemond's cruelty and wondered what kind of king he would be if Aegon did not recover. And they were losing the unity that had once bound them together, as Otto's careful diplomacy gave way to Aemond's fire and blood. Alicent understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the war had become something larger than any of them. It was no longer about succession or law or the will of the late king. It was about revenge. It was about grief. It was about the terrible momentum of violence that feeds on itself, growing stronger with every death, until no one remembers what they were fighting for in the first place. She sat beside Aegon's bed one evening, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest beneath the bandages. His face was turned away from her, hidden in shadow, and she could hear the ragged whisper of his breath. She reached out and touched his hand, the skin cool and still. He did not stir. He did not know she was there, and she wondered, in the silence of that room, whether the son she had raised was already gone, whether the man in the bed was only a shell, kept alive by the maester's arts but emptied of everything that had made him Aegon. Outside, the wind carried the distant sound of a dragon's roar, Vargar hunting in the night, Aemond still riding. The war would continue at dawn, as it had every dawn since the first blood was spilled, and Alicent would remain in the Red Keep, watching and praying for a peace that seemed more impossible with each passing day. The family's promise of stability had become a memory, and all that remained was the slow, grinding machinery of a war that would not end until it had consumed everything. With Aemond ruling as Prince Regent, the Greens held King's Landing, but the city was a cage of tension. The king lay broken in his chambers, the Queen Mother paced the corridors of the Red Keep, and the Prince Regent rode Vargar across the Riverlands, burning villages and castles in a show of force that was as much about terror as it was about strategy. But while Aemond was away, the capital grew vulnerable. Rhaenyra and Daemon had been waiting for this moment. The fall of King's Landing did not come with a great battle in the streets. It came with a whisper and a key. Daemon Targaryen had allies inside the city, men who remembered the days of Viserys, men who had once served the crown and now saw the Greens as usurpers. The Gold Cloaks, the same force Daemon had commanded years earlier, opened the gates in the dead of night. Rhaenyra's dragons descended on the city without warning. Syrax, Caraxes, and the young dragons of the Blacks circled above the Red Keep, their shadows cutting across the stone like blades. Alicent was in her chambers when the news came. She heard the shouts first, then the roar of dragons overhead. Helena was with her, sitting in a corner, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on nothing. The Queen Mother rose and walked to the window. She saw the banners of House Targaryen, the red three-headed dragon on black, being raised over the gates. The Blacks had taken the city. There was no resistance. Aemond was far away, and Aegon was too broken to command. The castle that had once been the centre of Alicent's power was now a trap closing around her. Rhaenyra and Daemon entered the Red Keep without bloodshed. The guards laid down their swords. The servants fled or knelt. Alicent stood in the great hall as the doors opened, and her former friend walked in, dressed in black and gold, a crown upon her head. Rhaenyra did not gloat. She looked at Alicent with something between pity and cold satisfaction. Daemon stood beside her, his hand resting on Dark Sister's hilt, his eyes scanning the room as if he expected an ambush that never came. Alicent was not executed. Rhaenyra spared her, but that mercy was a kind of cruelty. The Queen Mother, who had once directed the court, who had shaped the succession, who had placed her son on the Iron Throne, was reduced to a prisoner in her own home. She was confined to a tower in Maegor's Holdfast, with only a few servants to attend her. Helena was kept in a separate chamber, her mind already fractured by the death of her son and the weight of the war. Alicent could not reach her. She could not comfort her. She could not protect her remaining children. Aemond was still at large. Darren was in the Reach, and Aegon lay hidden somewhere in the city, too wounded to flee. The castle that had symbolised Alicent's rise now became the setting for her humiliation and grief. She had walked these halls as queen, as the mother of kings. Now she walked them as a ghost, unseen and unheard. The guards who passed her did not bow. The servants who brought her meals did not meet her eyes. She was allowed to keep her chambers, but the doors were locked from the outside. Every window looked out onto a city that had turned against her. Every corridor reminded her of the children she had lost and the ones she could not save. Rhaenyra took the throne. She sat in the Great Hall, surrounded by her loyalists, and began to rule. But her victory was fragile. The Greens still held power in the Reach and the Stormlands. Aemond was burning the Riverlands with Vargar, and in the dungeons of the Red Keep, a broken Queen Mother sat alone, counting the days until the war would turn again. The fall of King's Landing was not the end. It was only the beginning of a new and darker chapter. For the woman who had once been the most powerful in the realm, days passed in that tower, each one bleeding into the next like the colours of a dying sunset. Alicent watched the sky from her window, tracking the dragons that came and went. She saw Syrax land in the courtyard below, Rhaenyra's golden beast folding its wings like a closing fan. She saw the black banners flutter from every tower, replacing the green she had once raised with such hope. The silence of her captivity was broken only by the distant sounds of the city. The cheers of the small folk who had welcomed Rhaenyra, the clang of smiths forging new armour for the blacks, the occasional roar of a dragon taking flight. Alicent had no books, no letters, no visitors save for the silent servants who brought her meals. She began to talk to herself, not out of madness, but out of a desperate need to hear a voice that was not her own thoughts. She recited prayers to the Seven, but the words felt hollow. She remembered the day she had first come to court as a girl, so full of ambition and fear. She remembered the night she had lain with Viserys, the weight of duty pressing down on her. She remembered the births of her children, the joy and the pain, the hope that each one would be the one to secure her legacy. And now, all of it had led to this: a stone room, a locked door, and a crown that belonged to another woman. Meanwhile, the war raged on. Aemond, learning of the fall of King's Landing, flew into a fury. He turned Vhagar toward the capital, but Daemon intercepted him over the God's Eye. The two dragons met in a battle that would become legend. A clash of fire and fang that lit the sky like a second sun. Aemond fell, his body lost to the lake below, and Vargar crashed into the water, a death throw sending waves across the shore. Daemon did not return. Some said he died with his nephew, locked in a final embrace of hatred. Others whispered that he had survived and vanished into the east, waiting for a time when he would be needed again. But the truth was never known. What was known was that the Blacks had lost their greatest warrior, and the Greens had lost their most terrible weapon. In the Reach, Daemon Targaryen rallied the Hightower forces, but his army was scattered by the arrival of the Lannister host, who had switched sides after learning of Aegon's disappearance. Daemon was captured and executed, Dragon Tessarion killed by a volley of scorpion bolts. The last of Alicent's sons was gone, save for Aegon, who had been smuggled out of King's Landing by loyalists and taken to the Free Cities. Rhaenyra's spies searched for him, but he had vanished into the labyrinth of SOC politics, a ghost king waiting in the shadows. Alicent learned of her sons' fates, not from a messenger, but from the silence. The guards stopped mentioning Aemond's raids. The servants no longer whispered about Daeron's victories. One morning, she looked out her window and saw that the black banners were still there, and she knew. She sank to her knees, her hands gripping the stone sill, and she wept. She wept for Aemond, who had been born with a fire she could never tame. She wept for Daeron, who had been kind and gentle, a boy who loved music and poetry. She wept for Helena, who sat in her own tower, lost to a world of dreams and shadows. And she wept for Aegon, her firstborn, the king who had never wanted the crown and who now wore it in exile. Rhaenyra's rule grew harsher. The treasury was empty, the city hungry, and the lords of the realm divided. She raised taxes to pay for her dragons and her armies, and the small folk began to grumble. The smell of burning villages drifted on the wind, and the dragons that had once been symbols of glory became omens of dread. Rhaenyra grew paranoid. She saw traitors in every shadow, and her hand grew heavy. She executed lords who had served the Greens, even those who had bent the knee. She ordered the arrest of anyone who spoke the name of Aegon the Elder. The Red Keep, once a place of courtly intrigue, became a fortress of fear. Alicent watched it all from her tower. She saw the executions in the courtyard, the heads mounted on spikes, the blood that stained the stones. She saw Rhaenyra grow thin and pale, her eyes ringed with sleeplessness. She saw the queen who had once been her friend become a tyrant, and in the quiet of her cell, Alicent began to pray again. Not for victory, not for revenge, but for an end. She prayed for the war to stop, for the dragons to fall silent, for the realm to know peace, even if that peace meant her own death. But the war did not stop. It only changed shape. The lords who had followed Rhaenyra began to abandon her. The Velaryons, once her staunchest allies, grew cold. The north sent no more men. The riverlands were ash, and in the streets of King's Landing, the small folk began to whisper a name. Aegon the Younger, Rhaenyra's own son, a boy of 12 who had been kept in the shadows. Some said he was the true heir, the one who could unite the realm. Others said he was a puppet, a tool for those who wished to see Rhaenyra fall. Alicent heard these whispers from her servants, who spoke in hushed tones when they thought she could not hear. She knew what was coming. She had seen it before, in the days of the Great Council, in the years of Viserys' decline. The wheel was turning again, and when it finally stopped, she would be there to see who was crushed beneath it. The end came on a stormy night, when the rain lashed against the windows of Maegor's holdfast. Rhaenyra was dragged from her chambers by a mob of small folk who had stormed the Red Keep. They had been paid by the lords who had turned against her, but their fury was real. They remembered the taxes, the burnings, the hunger. They remembered the dragons that had brought fire to their homes. They dragged Rhaenyra through the streets, her golden hair, and they killed her in the shadow of the dragon pit. Her body was never recovered. Her son, Aegon the Younger, was crowned king in her place, a boy king who would rule under the regency of the lords who had betrayed his mother. Alicent heard the roar of the mob, the screams, the silence that followed. She stood at her window, watching the rain wash the blood from the stones. She did not weep. She had no tears left. She simply stood there, a woman who had lost everything, in a castle that had once been her home. The doors of her tower were unlocked. She was free to go, but she had nowhere to go. Her children were dead or gone. Her husband was dead. Her father was dead. Her name was a curse whispered in the streets. She walked through the empty halls of the Red Keep, past the throne that was now occupied by a boy who was not her son, past the guards who did not know her, past the tapestries that told the stories of a dynasty that was crumbling around her. She found Helena's chamber empty. The princess had thrown herself from a window the night before, joining her sons in the grave. Alicent stood in that room, looking at the broken glass, the cold wind blowing through the gap. She did not scream. She did not fall. She simply turned and walked away. The dance of the dragons was over. The realm was broken. And Alicent Hightower, the queen who had started it all, walked out of the Red Keep and into the city, a ghost among the living, carrying nothing but the weight of her memories. She was never seen again. Some said she died in the streets, unnoticed and unmourned. Others said she fled across the narrow sea to live out her days in a quiet corner. The Red Keep had become a cage, and for Helaena Targaryen, the bars were made of memory. She had never been the same after Blood and Cheese. The murder of her son Jaehaerys had carved something out of her that could not be restored. And now, with Rhaenyra's forces holding the castle, with her mother Alicent confined to her chambers and her brother Aegon vanished into the city's shadows, Helaena retreated further into a world that no one else could reach. She spoke in riddles, in prophecies that sounded like warnings, in fragments of grief that made the court uneasy. Some said she had always been touched by a strange clarity, a gift for seeing what others could not. But now that gift had turned inward, and what she saw was only loss. Alice watched her daughter slip away, and she could do nothing. The Queen Mother, who had once commanded the Green Council, who had manoeuvred through decades of court politics, who had raised her children to sit the Iron Throne, now sat in a silent room in Maegor's Holdfast, listening to the echoes of a war she had helped start. She had fought for her children. She had believed she was protecting them, and one by one, they were being taken from her. Helena's despair deepened with each passing day. She would not eat. She would not speak to anyone, except in cryptic phrases that made the guards uncomfortable. She spent hours staring out of windows that faced the godswood, as if she could see something beyond the trees. And then one morning, she was found at the base of a tower. The fall had been quick. The grief had been final. When Alicent heard the news, something inside her broke. She had already lost her husband, her father, her place at court. She had seen her son Aegon burned and broken at Rook's Rest. She had watched her daughter Helaena wither into a ghost. But this was different. This was the death of a child she had held, had nursed, had tried to shield from the cruelty of the world. And it had happened not in battle, not at the hands of an enemy, but by Helena's own hand, driven by a despair that Alicent could not soothe. The Queen Mother wept in a way she had not allowed herself to weep since the days of her youth. She wept for Helaena. She wept for Jaehaerys. She wept for the family that had been torn apart by ambition and fire. And she wept because she knew, deep in her bones, that the war was not finished. There were more losses to come. Aemond Targaryen had become the Green's most feared weapon. With Aegon incapacitated, Aemond rode Vargar, the largest dragon in the world, and he burned his way across the Riverlands. He was ruthless, impatient, and driven by a need to prove himself. He had lost an eye as a boy, and that wound had never healed. Now he wore an eye patch of sapphire and a crown of arrogance. He believed himself invincible. But Daemon Targaryen, the rogue prince, the king consort of the Blacks, had other plans. Daemon had been waiting for this confrontation. He had lost his stepson Lucerys. He had lost his brother Viserys. He had lost the peace he had never truly wanted. And now he rode Caraxes, the bloodworm, a dragon as fierce and unpredictable as its rider. The two dragons met above the God's Eye, a vast lake in the Riverlands. It was a battle that would become legend. Vhagar was older, larger, more powerful. Caraxes was faster, more agile, more experienced in combat. The two beasts tore at each other in the sky, their roars echoing across the water. Aemond and Daemon fought not just with dragonfire, but with blades, leaping from saddle to saddle in a desperate struggle. And then, in a moment that no chronicler could fully describe, both dragons fell. They plunged into the lake, locked together, their bodies disappearing beneath the dark surface. Vhagar and Caraxes were gone. Aemond and Daemon were gone. The waters of the God's Eye closed over them, and neither prince nor dragon ever emerged. When word reached King's Landing, Alicent received the news in silence. She had already lost Helaena. Now she had lost Aemond, the son who had been both her pride and her terror. She had watched him grow from a sharp-eyed boy into a ruthless young man, and she had known, perhaps, that his ambition would consume him. But knowing did not make the loss easier. She sat in her chamber, the same chamber where she had once plotted with Otto, where she had dressed for tourneys, where she had raised her children, and she felt the emptiness grow. There was still Daeron. Alicent's youngest son had been sent to Oldtown as a ward, away from the chaos of King's Landing. He had grown into a capable young man, a dragon rider, who rode to Sarion, the Blue Queen. He had fought in the Reach, in the battles that swirled around the town of Tumbleton. But the war in the Reach was a mess of shifting loyalties, betrayals and fire. At Tumbleton, Daeron and Tessarion were caught in a catastrophe. The details were murky, but the result was clear. Daeron was dead, killed in the chaos, his dragon slain alongside him. The last of Alicent's sons had fallen. One by one, the children for whom Alicent had fought, for whom she had schemed and sacrificed and endured, became casualties of the war she had helped unleash. Helaena, Aemond, Daeron, and Aegon, though still alive, was a broken shell of a king, hiding in the shadows of the city, his body ruined by fire. Alicent had believed she was securing their future. She had believed that the Iron Throne was worth the price, that the price had been everything, and she was left alone in the Red Keep, a prisoner of her own choices, surrounded by the ghosts of the family she had tried to protect. The war would continue. Rhaenyra's reign would falter. Aegon would return. But for Alicent, the war was already over. She had lost her children, and with them, any hope of redemption. She would spend her remaining years in confinement, her mind haunted by the faces of the dead, her heart hollowed out by grief. The dance of the dragons had consumed them all, but none more completely than the mother who had tried to hold her family together. And as the realm burned, as the dragons died, as the throne passed from one broken ruler to another, Alicent Hightower sat in the quiet of her captivity, listening to the silence, waiting for the end. The news of Aemond's death reached King's Landing before the dragons had finished falling. Daemon and Caraxes had pulled Vagar into the lake, and the waters of the God's Eye swallowed them both. Aemond was gone, Vagar was gone, and in the Red Keep, Rhaenyra sat on the Iron Throne, her hold on the capital tightening with every hour. For Alicent, the losses had become a kind of steady drumbeat. First her son Daeron cut down in the Reach, then Helaena, driven by grief to throw herself from a window, and now Aemond, the most dangerous of her children, dead in a battle that felt more like a suicide pact than a victory. But the war was not finished. Across the narrow sea, the last Green Prince still lived. Aegon II, burned and broken from the battle at Rook's Rest, had fled King's Landing before Rhaenyra's capture. He was hidden somewhere in the Crownlands, nursed by loyalists, his body a ruin of scar tissue and missing fingers, but his mind still fixed on reclaiming the throne. And while Rhaenyra ruled in the capital, her grip grew brittle. The treasury was empty. The people of King's Landing had never loved her, and the dragons that had once been the Targaryen glory were now mostly dead or scattered. In the chaos of those months, Aegon II gathered what remained of the green forces. He had no dragon of his own anymore. Sunfire was still alive, but wounded and barely able to fly. Yet he had something else, the memory of a crown. With the help of Lord Corlys Velaryon and a handful of loyal knights, Aegon slipped back into King's Landing in the dead of night. Rhaenyra had been betrayed by the very city she tried to rule. The gates opened, the gold cloaks turned, and within hours, Rhaenyra was fleeing through the tunnels beneath the Red Keep, her reign over before it had truly begun. Aegon II briefly regained the throne. He was crowned again in the Great Hall, but it was a hollow ceremony. The city was starving, the realm was bleeding, and the king himself could barely stand, his body held together by milk of the poppy and sheer will. He ordered executions. He demanded loyalty. But the war had already consumed everything worth fighting for. The green cause was a skeleton, and Aegon was its ghost. It did not last. Before he could secure any lasting victory, before he could even begin to rebuild, the poison came. Some say it was the work of his own council, men who saw that the war would never end while he lived. Others whisper that it was a final act of revenge from the Black Loyalists still hidden in the court. Whatever the source, the cup was poured, and Aegon II drank. He died in the same Red Keep, where his father had breathed his last, where his mother had once held court, where the dance of the dragons had been conceived in whispered conversations and secret councils. The war ended not with triumph for the Greens or the Blacks, but with a traumatized child king. Aegon III was only 10 years old when he was pulled from the chaos and placed on the Iron Throne. He had seen his mother Rhaenyra fed to a dragon. He had seen his uncle's body carried through the streets. He had seen dragons die, one after another, until the skies over Westeros were empty. The boy king would rule for 26 years, but he would never smile. The realm called him Aegon the Dragonbane, because under his reign, the last of the Targaryen dragons perished. The war that had begun with a disputed succession ended with a child who carried the weight of a broken dynasty. And what of Alicent? She remained confined in King's Landing, isolated from power, haunted by the dead of both families. After Rhaenyra's fall and Aegon's brief return, the Greens had no further use for her. She was a queen mother without a throne, a widow without a husband, a mother who had outlived almost all of her children. The Red Keep became her prison, not with bars and locks, but with the silent walls of a palace that remembered every decision she had ever made. She walked the same corridors where she had once plotted with Otto, where she had argued with Rhaenyra, where she had watched her sons grow into weapons. Now the corridors were empty, the voices were gone. She died in 133 AC in King's Landing, just a few years after the war ended. The histories record her death quietly, almost as an afterthought. There was no great funeral, no outpouring of grief. She was remembered as a queen, a mother, a rival, and one of the central architects of the Dance of the Dragons. But in the end, she was just a woman who had spent her life trying to secure a future for her children, only to watch that future burn. The green gown she had worn at the tourney, the symbol of her faction, had long since faded. The ashes of the dance covered everything, and Alicent Hightower, the daughter of Oldtown, the wife of a king, the mother of a dynasty that never was, became another name in the long list of those who had shaped a war that no one truly won.